But she came back to bury the past. Instead, she found it had been breathing the whole time, and it had her family's name carved into its chest. Vivian Mercer stepped off the train into a city that should have been dead. Ravenport, 12 years gone. 12 years of silence, distance, and the particular kind of forgetting you have to work at every single day. She had gotten good at it. She had gotten so good that some mornings in Boston she could almost convince herself that this city, this name, this version of herself had never existed at all. The platform smelled like diesel and river water and something she couldn't name. Something older. She told herself it was just a weekend, her mother's birthday. 2 days, maybe 3. She'd smile, she'd eat cake, she'd sleep in her old bedroom with the ceiling that still had the water stain shaped like a bird, and then she'd get back on a train and return to the life she'd built from scratch. The clean, quiet, deliberately ordinary life that asked nothing of her except skill and patience. She had no idea that by the time she got back on that train, everything she thought she'd left behind would be standing right in front of her, waiting, like it had never moved. If this story hits somewhere deep, drop a like, leave a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Marseille. The cab ride from the station took longer than she remembered. Not because the traffic was worse, because the city was different. Vivian sat in the back seat with her bag on her lap and watched Ravenport pass outside the window. And the longer she watched, the more wrong it felt. Not wrong the way a city gets when it falls apart. Wrong the way a city looks when it's been put back together by hands you don't recognize. The industrial district on the east side, the stretch of warehouses and shuttered factories that had been rotting since the steel plant closed in the early 2000s, was lit up. Not just lit, alive. The old Hartwell Ironworks had been converted into something. She could see warm light through tall windows, a restaurant sign she didn't recognize, people moving around inside. 3 blocks down, a brewery, a gallery, a row of small storefronts with lights on at 8 in the evening. She leaned forward. Hey, what happened to the east side? The cab driver glanced in the rearview mirror. He was maybe 60, heavy-set, a saint's cap pulled down over gray temples. You from here? Used to be. Then you know how bad it got. I know how bad it was when I left. He nodded slowly, the kind of nod that carries weight. Got worse after that. Banks pulled out. City council ran out of money, or said they did. Half those blocks were condemned by 2018. People were leaving in batches, not a flood. Just every few months, another family gone. So what changed? He didn't answer right away. She watched his hands on the wheel, big hands, careful. Investment came in, he said finally. What kind of investment? Another pause. The kind that doesn't make a lot of noise. She sat back. Outside, the gallery disappeared behind a corner and was replaced by a block of older residential buildings, the kind that had been standing since the 1940s and looked it. But even these looked steadier than she remembered. Fresh paint, repaired stoops, window boxes with actual flowers. She asked where the money came from. The driver was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer at all. Then he said, low and even, You ask enough people in this city, they'll all give you a different name, but eventually all those names lead back to the same one. She waited. He didn't say it. She looked back out the window and told herself it didn't matter. It wasn't her city anymore. Whoever had fixed it up, they could have it. She was here for her mother's birthday, and then she was gone. The cab pulled up to her parents' house on Carver Street at 8:23. The porch light was on. The maple in the front yard, the one her father had planted the spring she turned 7, had gotten enormous. She sat in the back seat for a moment and looked at the house and tried to remember why she'd stayed away so long. The reason was still there. It had just gotten easier to avoid thinking about it. She paid the driver, thanked him, got out. The night air was warm for April and smelled like cut grass and something faintly sweet from the bakery 2 streets over. She stood on the sidewalk with her bag over one shoulder and looked up at the house and noticed, for the first time, that it had been repainted. Not recently, maybe a year ago, maybe 2. The trim was a deep navy instead of the peeling white she remembered. The front steps had been rebuilt. The flower beds on either side of the walk were immaculate in a way her parents had never had the time or the money to maintain. Her mother opened the front door before she reached the porch. Ellen Mercer was 59 years old, still small, still quick, still possessed of the particular energy that had always made a room feel either warmer or more dangerous depending on her mood. Right now she was smiling, and the sight of it did something complicated to Vivian's chest. "You actually came," her mother said. "I said I would." "You've said a lot of things over the years." "Mom." Ellen opened her arms. Vivian walked into the hug and stayed there a beat longer than she meant to. Her mother smelled like lavender and coffee and the particular brand of hand soap she'd used since Vivian was a child. Some things didn't change. Some things you didn't want to. "Your father's in the kitchen," Ellen said, pulling back. "He made that pasta you used to like, the one with the breadcrumbs." "He still makes that?" "He makes it every time he wants to feel like things are normal." She paused. "So yes, he makes it a lot." Vivian followed her mother inside. The house was better than she expected. She'd been preparing herself for the version she remembered from her last visit 7 years ago. Tired furniture, a kitchen that needed updating, the creaky third step on the staircase that her father had been meaning to fix since 2005. The creaky step was still there, but the kitchen had been redone. Not expensively, not with the kind of finishes you saw in renovation magazines, but solidly. New countertops, new cabinets, a refrigerator that was less than 5 years old. Her father was standing at the stove when she came in. Thomas Mercer, 62, had the look of a man who had worked very hard for a long time and was only now beginning to let himself breathe. He was heavier than she remembered and moved more carefully, but when he turned around and saw her, his face broke open in a way that made her throat tighten. "There she is," he said. "Hi, Dad." He crossed the kitchen and hugged her the way he always had, one arm tight across her shoulders, one hand on the back of her head, the way he used to when she was small and the world outside was too large. She pressed her face into his shoulder and felt, without warning, the specific grief of time you can't get back. "You look good," he said. "You look like you've been sleeping. First time in years." He said it like a fact, not a complaint. "Things have been better lately. Work picked up. The consulting thing actually, it's been real. Real work, real pay. I keep waiting for it to fall apart." "Why would it fall apart?" "Because it's too good," he said. "And the good things in this city don't usually last." She looked at him for a moment. "But this one has? Going on 2 years." He went back to the stove. "Some investment firm out of New York brought me on as a regional consultant. Municipal infrastructure. I know the city. I know the vendors. I know where the bodies are buried. Not literally before you say anything." He smiled. "It pays 3 times what I was making at the county. Benefits. Travel allowance." "Which firm?" "Meridian Capital Partners. You've heard of them?" She hadn't, but the question settled somewhere in the back of her mind and stayed there. They ate dinner at the kitchen table, the 3 of them, the way they used to before she left. The pasta was exactly as she remembered. Her father had made garlic bread. Her mother had opened a bottle of wine she clearly hadn't been saving for a special occasion, but pretended she had. It should have been simple. It should have been exactly what she needed. Instead, Vivian sat across from her parents and watched them be okay, and couldn't stop thinking about how it had happened. She'd grown up watching this house get smaller under financial pressure. Watched her parents argue in low voices about bills they thought she couldn't hear. Watched her father work 2 jobs through most of her high school years. Watched her mother quietly cut luxuries one at a time. The gym membership, the cable, the weekly dinners out. Until the texture of their life had gone thin and careful. That was the Ravenport she'd left. Not the city. Her parents' version of it. This version, the repainted house, the new kitchen, the consulting salary, felt like someone had reached in and fixed what was broken. Fixed it so smoothly that her parents had simply accepted it as their due, as normalcy, as the world finally coming around. That's not how the world worked. In Vivian's experience, the world didn't come around, not without a reason. "Tell me about the house," she said. Her mother looked up from her wine. "What about it? The paint, the kitchen. When did you redo it?" Her parents exchanged a glance, brief but there, the kind of glance that happens between 2 people who have an agreed version of a story. "Last year," her mother said. There was a community development program. Grant money. A lot of families on this block got work done. What program? Some nonprofit? Ravenport Heritage Initiative, I think. You think? Vivian. Her mother's voice was patient. It happened. We didn't ask too many questions. When someone offers to fix your roof, you don't interrogate them. You say thank you. Who ran it? Another glance. Her father set down his fork. Why does it matter? I'm curious. You're doing that thing you do, he said, not unkindly. That thing where something is fine and you need to pull at it until it isn't. She looked at her hands. Maybe he was right. But she was sitting in a house that had been quietly, methodically improved over 2 years, in a city that had been quietly, methodically rebuilt by money that had come from somewhere and someone who had never felt the need to introduce themselves. And her father was working for a consulting firm she'd never heard of. And her mother had gotten medical treatment, the blood pressure issues, the specialists her parents hadn't been able to afford, that apparently had been covered somehow. She hadn't asked about that yet. She made a note to herself to ask about it carefully. They finished dinner and her mother brought out a cake, even though the birthday was 2 days away, because Ellen Mercer believed in preemptive celebration. Vivian laughed and ate cake and tried to be present. She was mostly successful. Later, in her old bedroom with the bird-shaped water stain, she lay on her back and stared at the ceiling and made a list in her head of the things she'd noticed. The house, the neighborhood, the job, the medical, the Ravenport Heritage Initiative, Meridian Capital Partners. She thought about what the cab driver had said. Eventually, all those names led back to the same one. She had not let herself think about that name all evening. She let herself think about it now, alone in the dark, in the room where she had first learned to want things she knew she shouldn't. Dominic Falcone. She said it once, inside her own skull, and then she pushed it back down. It was late. She was tired. She was reading patterns into coincidences because she was anxious and suspicious by nature, and because the last time she'd been in the city, she'd had her heart broken in a way that had taken years to stop shaping every decision she made. She turned onto her side and closed her eyes and was asleep within minutes. Her dreams were not quiet. Yet, in the morning she walked. She had always walked when she needed to think. Boston had trained her into a distance runner of thought. She could cover 4 miles of city block and emerge on the other side with a problem reorganized, a feeling placed, a decision reached. Ravenport felt smaller underfoot than Boston, but the streets were more interesting. More history per block. More texture. She walked east toward the harbor without planning to. The morning was pale and cool, the kind of April morning that hadn't committed to spring yet, and she had her jacket zipped to the collar and her hands in her pockets. The streets were quiet. A few people walking dogs, a woman with a stroller, a man hosing down the sidewalk outside a coffee shop. The coffee shop was new. She stopped. It occupied the corner space that had been a pawn shop for as long as she could remember. She used to walk past it in high school and look at the instruments in the window, the guitars and the trumpet and the sad parade of objects people had traded for rent money. The pawn shop was gone. The coffee shop was called Still Point, and it was the kind of careful, thoughtful space that cost a lot of money to make look like it didn't cost a lot of money. Wood surfaces, good lighting, a chalkboard with the day's roasts. She went in, ordered a coffee, took it outside, and kept walking. 4 blocks east, she passed a building that had been a garment factory in the early 20th century, an abandoned shell in the 2000s, and was now, according to the sign outside, the Ravenport Community Arts Center. Through the ground floor windows, she could see a ceramic studio, wheel-throwing setups, what looked like a dark room. Upstairs, framed through the tall windows, paintings on walls. She stood on the sidewalk with her coffee and looked at the building for a long time. This was not what happened to post-industrial cities in America. This was not the story. The story was that the factories closed, the money left, the city hollowed out, and the people who stayed made do with less. The story was measured in foreclosures and school closures and the steady bleeding of a tax base. Ravenport had been following that story faithfully for 20 years. It had been following it so faithfully she'd stopped expecting anything else. She turned north and walked another 6 blocks and found herself in a residential neighborhood she remembered for being rough. Not criminally rough, just the grinding roughness of poverty, of deferred maintenance, of people living in houses they were slowly losing. The houses here looked like the houses on her parents' street. Not new, not renovated to the point of displacement, just repaired, maintained, occupied. On one block, she counted 7 houses that had new windows. Not all the same style, different contractors, different decisions. But new windows on 7 consecutive houses didn't happen by accident. It didn't happen through coincidence or community spirit alone. It happened when someone with resources decided it was going to happen. She finished her coffee and turned around and walked back to Carver Street. And the whole way back, she was building the shape of a question she didn't quite want to ask yet. That afternoon, her college roommate called. Marisol Cruz was 3 years out of a marriage, currently living in Philadelphia, and possessed of the particular gift of knowing when someone she loved was about to do something complicated. "You went back to Ravenport," she said, without a greeting. "My mother's birthday." "Sure. How's the city?" "Different." "Different how?" Vivian was sitting on the front porch, watching a neighbor walk a very old golden retriever down Carver Street. "Like someone fixed it," she said. "Rebuilt chunks of it, but quietly, like they didn't want to be noticed." A pause, then, "Have you heard the name?" Vivian looked at the end of the block. "Which name?" "Vivian?" "I heard it last night, in my head. I pushed it back down." "How's that working for you?" "Poorly." Marisol made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "You know you're going to look into it. I'm here for my mother's birthday." "You've already been walking around taking notes, haven't you?" It wasn't a question. Vivian didn't answer, which was its own answer. "Here's what I know," Marisol said, "because I do actual journalism and keep up with things. Dominic Falcone is, depending on who you ask, either a real estate developer, a private equity player, a legitimate businessman in the process of cleaning up a complicated family legacy, or one of the most connected organized crime figures on the East Coast, possibly all 4 simultaneously. I know what he is. You knew what he was at 22. What he is now is bigger." "How much bigger?" "The kind of bigger that means the FBI has a file. The kind that means politicians in 3 states return his calls first. The kind that means when he decides to rebuild a city, it gets rebuilt." Vivian was quiet. "He's based in Ravenport," Marisol continued. "Has been for the last several years. Came back about 4 years ago. Before that, he was in New York, running the family business up there. He came home." She came home. He came home. All roads apparently led home. "I'm not going to see him," Vivian said. "Okay." "I mean it." "Okay." "Stop saying okay like that." "Like what?" "Like you're keeping count." Marisol paused. "I'm just saying, if you go digging into what happened to Ravenport and all roads lead to one name, and that name is, I know, you can't just look at the threads and not follow them. Watch me." But after she hung up, she sat on the porch a little longer, and the golden retriever came back down the block on its return loop, and the afternoon light was doing something particular to the old maple tree, and she thought about the water-stained bird on her bedroom ceiling, and she thought about who had paid for the kitchen, and she thought about her father saying, "I keep waiting for it to fall apart." She pulled out her phone and typed Meridian Capital Partners into the search bar. The results came back fast. Meridian Capital Partners, LLC. Incorporated in Delaware, 2019. Registered agent address in New York. Listed activities: real estate investment, community development financing, municipal consulting services. No names. No executives listed on the website. The website itself was minimal to the point of being suspicious. 1 page, a phone number, an email, a brief paragraph of corporate language that said nothing concrete. She navigated to the New York State Business Registry and ran a search for the registered agent. The agent was a law firm called Kellner Doyle Associates. She searched that name. Kellner Doyle came up in a 2021 article from a New York business journal, listed among a group of firms that had represented Falcone Industries in a portfolio reorganization. Falcone Industries. There it was, small, buried, a corporate footnote, but it was there. She sat with that for a minute. Then she searched Ravenport Heritage Initiative. The nonprofit was registered in 2020. Governing documents listed a board of directors that was all local names, none of which she recognized. Funding sources listed as private grants and community development partnerships. Executive Director. None currently listed. Tax filings available. She pulled the most recent 990. The major donors section showed one source listed as an anonymous donor through a donor-advised fund at a financial institution called Vellum Trust. She searched Vellum Trust. She got 3 results. One was a small article from a financial newsletter dated 2022 describing Vellum Trust as a private philanthropic vehicle operated by interests connected to the Falcone family of Ravenport, New York. She put her phone down. She picked it up again. She thought about the windows on that residential block. 7 houses. She thought about the arts center and the garment factory. She thought about Still Point Coffee Shop and the gallery and the brewery and the old Hartwell Ironworks. She thought about her father's consulting salary and her mother's medical coverage and the repainted trim and the rebuilt front steps. She thought about doing this for 12 years without ever once reaching out. The sun was going down. Her mother was calling her name from inside the house. Dinner. She put the phone in her pocket and went inside and sat down at the table and ate the meal her parents had made, and she smiled and she answered questions about Boston and her work and whether she was seeing anyone. And the whole time she was sitting there being a daughter, she was thinking about a 22-year-old girl standing outside a bus station with a bag and a broken heart, and about a boy she had left behind in the city, and about the quiet, methodical, patient way someone had reached back through 12 years of silence and remade her family's life around them, without asking, without being asked. She didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, she borrowed her mother's car. She drove to the east side to the building that had been the Hartwell Ironworks, and she parked across the street and sat there looking at it. Up close, it was even more impressive than it had seemed from the cab. The structural bones of the old factory had been preserved. The heavy brick, the tall windows, the loading dock doors converted to glass entryways. But it had been redesigned with the kind of attention that suggested someone had cared whether it lasted. Whoever had done this hadn't been trying to flip it. They'd been trying to anchor it. A woman in her 30s came out of the front entrance with a coffee cup and a canvas bag. Vivian got out of the car. "Excuse me," she said. "Do you work here?" The woman turned. She had the look of someone who ran something. A certain directness in the eyes, a certain readiness. "I own the restaurant on the 2nd floor. Can I help you?" I grew up here. I'm visiting. I was asking about the building." "Incredible space, right?" The woman's expression opened up. "We moved in 3 years ago. I almost didn't believe it when I heard the terms." "What terms?" "The lease structure. It was way below market. The whole development model here is below market. Long-term leases, locked rents, build-out support. My landlord has never once tried to push me out. In 15 years of running restaurants, that's a first." Vivian looked at the building. "Who's your landlord?" "A holding company. Falcone something." She shrugged in a way that said the name was unremarkable to her. "But whoever manages it has been good, really good. I don't know the story behind it, and honestly, I stopped asking." Vivian thanked her and got back in the car. She drove to 3 more locations across the east side and the north residential district. At each one, she found the same pattern. Below market terms. Long-term commitments. Hands-off management. No branding, no visibility, no presence. Just the structures themselves. Holding. By noon, she was back in her mother's car, parked outside a building near the harbor that she'd looked up in the property records that morning. A 12-story tower, converted from office to mixed-income residential housing in 2021. 40% of units at below-market rent. The rest at market. All the math structured so the market rate units subsidized the affordable ones. A model that required someone to absorb significant returns. Property records showed the owner of record as a limited partnership called Harbor View Community Development Associates. The registered agent was Kellner Doyle. She was looking at the building when her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number, Boston area code. She answered. "Ms. Mercer," said a woman's voice. Formal, composed. The kind of composed that was performed. "My name is Serena Falcone. I believe you've been doing some research this morning that's likely to bring you to a name you already know. I thought it might be more efficient if you heard something directly before you went any further." The silence between them had texture. "How do you know what I've been doing?" Vivian said. "Ravenport is a small city with attentive people," Serena said. And my brother has always had very good surveillance on the properties he cares about. My brother. Vivian looked out the windshield at the converted tower, at the families visible through the lobby windows, a woman with 2 children, a man in a work jacket, an older couple near the mailboxes. What do you want to tell me? She said. I want to tell you, Serena said, and her voice shifted, not warmer, but more direct, a sharpness under the polish, that my brother has been building a story about himself for 2 years that involves your family, your city, and a version of love that I personally find, she paused, questionable. What kind of story? The kind where the powerful man sacrifices everything for the woman who left him. Serena's tone was flat. The kind that makes very good cinema and very bad reality. The kind I would want someone who matters to him to examine carefully before they decide what it means. I haven't decided anything. You will. Once you finish connecting the threads. Another pause. I just want to make sure that when you do, you're asking the right questions. About whose benefit this served. About whether love looks like this or whether something else does. The call ended. Vivian sat in the car for a long time. The lobby of the building was still visible. The woman with the 2 children had sat down on a bench near the door. The children were doing something with a paper bag that involved a great deal of energetic disagreement. Ordinary life in a building that shouldn't exist at market rates. A building that existed because someone had decided it should. She started the car. She needed to see him. She had told herself she wouldn't. She had been very clear with herself about that. But whatever else Serena Falcone was doing, whether she was warning her, testing her, manipulating her, or something else entirely, she had done one thing. She had made avoidance feel like cowardice. Vivian Mercer had a lot of qualities she wasn't proud of. Cowardice wasn't one of them. She pulled out of the parking space and turned toward the harbor. Oh, the building didn't have a sign. She knew the address because the property records had given it to her. A converted warehouse near the water that showed on paper as a commercial holding. The lobby was all glass and dark steel and said nothing about what happened above it. There was a reception desk staffed by a man in a suit who looked at her with the particular stillness of someone trained to read threat levels. I'm here to see Dominic Falcone, she said. Do you have an appointment? No. Mr. Falcone doesn't take unscheduled dossier. My name is Vivian Mercer. She said it clearly, the way you said something you'd decided to stop being afraid of. Tell him that name, then we'll see about the appointment. The man looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up a phone. The wait was 40 seconds. She counted. The elevator is on your left, he said, top floor. She crossed the lobby to the elevator and pressed the button and stood very still while she waited. The elevator doors were polished steel and showed her a blurred version of herself. Dark hair, dark jacket, the particular posture of someone who had made a decision and was already regretting the circumstances but not the decision itself. The elevator arrived. She stepped in. The doors closed. She had 12 floors to decide what she was going to say. She had been composing versions of this speech for 12 years without knowing she was doing it. All the things she would say if she ever had to say them. All the careful, articulate, controlled language she had built around the memory of this person so that she could look at it without flinching. She had it prepared. She was ready. The elevator opened and she stepped into a space that was almost entirely glass overlooking Ravenport Harbor. And across the room, standing with his back to her and his hands in his pockets and his attention on the water below, was the man she'd left behind at 22, and every word she'd prepared dissolved. He was taller than she remembered, broader. The kind of physical presence that a person grew into rather than having from birth. He wore a dark suit with no tie, jacket still on, the particular formality of a man who worked this way. His hair was shorter than 12 years ago, and there were the beginnings of silver at the temples, which she had not prepared for, which did something to her chest she refused to name. He didn't turn around immediately. He stood looking at the harbor. Then he turned. His face was the same and entirely different, the way all faces are after 12 years. The architecture unchanged, but lived in now, marked by whatever had passed. The jaw was harder. The eyes were the same, dark, careful, always watching something behind the surface of whatever was directly in front of them. He looked at her the way you look at something you've imagined so many times you're not sure the real version is real. Vivian, he said, just her name, like he'd been waiting to say it in a room where she could actually hear it. "You rebuilt my parents' house," she said. He didn't move. "I improved the maintenance on a home that was deteriorating. You paid for my mother's cardiologist. Your mother needed a cardiologist. You created a consulting job for my father. Your father is exceptionally qualified and was underemployed. The work is real." "Dominic," her voice came out steadier than she felt. "You did all of this without telling them, without telling me." "Yes. For 2 years. For longer than that," he said quietly, "but the active work has been about 2 years." She stared at him. The harbor was behind him, gray-blue and vast. The city spread out beneath his window the way cities spread out beneath powerful men who have decided to own them. She thought about Serena Falcone's voice on the phone. "I find it questionable." And she thought about the woman with the 2 children in the lobby. And she thought about her father saying, "I keep waiting for it to fall apart." And all of it pressed up against the fact of him standing across this room from her. And she didn't know which feeling was loudest. "Say what you actually want to say," he said. "I don't know what I want to say." "That's new. This is new." She gestured at the room, at the window, at the city below. "This is... You were not this when I knew you." Something crossed his face. Brief. Not quite pain. "No, I wasn't." "What are you now?" He was quiet for a moment. "Exactly what you've already found out I am," he said. "I'm not going to make it sound better than that." "Did you do all of this because of me?" The question sat between them. The harbor was still. Through the glass, the city was going about its life. The brewery, the gallery, the art center, the families in their repaired homes, all of it alive because of the man standing in front of her, all of it moving without knowing whose hands had built its foundation. "I did it because it needed to be done," he said. "And because your family was here. And because..." He stopped, looked away. "Because I couldn't fix the thing I actually broke." She held that, turned it over. "You didn't break anything," she said finally. "I left. You left because I gave you no reason to stay." She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "That's not..." She stopped. The prepared speech was gone. All the clean language was gone. What was left was just the truth sitting there in her chest like something she'd been carrying without noticing. "That's not why I left." "Then tell me why," he said. Not confrontational, not demanding, just asking. After 12 years, just asking, like he had finally learned how to do it. Before she could answer, his phone buzzed. He glanced at it once. His expression didn't change, but something behind it did. Something tightened. "I need to take this," he said. "It's something that requires immediate attention." He met her eyes. "Will you be here when I'm done?" She should say no. She should say she'd gotten what she came for and she was leaving in 2 days. She should say all the reasonable things. "I'll be here," she said. He stepped away, turned toward the window, answered the phone. She heard him say 2 words before his voice dropped below audible. "How long?" And the way he said it, the flatness of it, the absence of surprise, told her that whatever was coming had been expected, had been building. That the man standing here in front of her, who had rebuilt an entire city for reasons he refused to explain, had been waiting for something to arrive. The afternoon light was changing on the harbor. Vivian stood in the silence of the room and looked at the city below and thought about everything she still didn't know, and about everything she'd already figured out, and about the 12 years of silence she'd mistaken for indifference that apparently had looked like this, like a whole city, remade, breathing. The call was short. He hung up, turned back to her. His face was composed, but something in the set of his jaw had changed. "What's wrong?" she said. "We'll talk," he said. "There's a lot I need to tell you, but there's something happening right now that..." He stopped, pressed his thumb against his lower lip. The gesture was the same as she remembered, the one he made when he was calculating, when something was moving faster than he'd planned for. "Dominic," she crossed the room, stopped 6 feet away. "What's happening?" He looked at her, and for the first time in the conversation, the composure showed its seams. Something underneath it was moving, something old and not entirely controlled. "My sister," he said, "is about to make a very serious mistake." and I don't know yet whether I can stop her. Vivian didn't stay in the penthouse. He'd asked her to. His assistant had shown her to a sitting room with coffee she didn't drink and a view she couldn't focus on, and after 20 minutes she'd stood up and told the assistant to let him know she'd be at her parents' house and walked out. She needed to think. She needed the distance between herself and that room, between herself and him, or the thinking would never happen and she'd end up making a decision from the wrong part of herself. On the drive back to Carver Street, she ran through what she knew. What she actually knew, not what she felt. Her parents' financial stability, real, documented, traceable, back to entities connected to Falcone Industries. Her parents' home improvements, the same. Dozens of families across Ravenport, the same pattern, the same hands, the same invisible architecture of money flowing toward people who didn't know where it came from. 2 years of active work, longer of preparation. The question Serena had planted, whose benefit did this serve, kept surfacing. She kept pushing it back down, because she had already looked at the evidence. She had spent a career in conservation learning how to read material, how to distinguish genuine from reproduction, how to find the truth in the thing itself rather than the story attached to it. And the evidence here said something simple. This had cost an enormous amount of money and delivered no visible return. No publicity, no political capital, no credit. The Ravenport Heritage Initiative didn't even have a website worth visiting. Nobody was putting Dominic Falcone's name on the Arts Center. If this was control, it was the most expensive, invisible control she'd ever encountered. She was turning onto Carver Street when her phone buzzed, a text from a number she didn't have saved. He won't tell you the whole story. I will, if you want it. S. She stared at the text. Then she put the phone face down on the passenger seat and pulled into her parents' driveway. Her mother was on the porch with a cup of tea. You were gone all day. I know. I'm sorry. Was it good or bad? Vivian got out of the car and stood at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at her mother and thought about the kitchen and the cardiologist and the windows on 7 consecutive houses and about a man standing at a window with his back to the harbor and about a phone call about a mistake that was about to happen. I don't know yet, she said honestly. Her mother studied her the way she always had, not intrusively, but with the precision of a woman who had watched her daughter closely enough to read her silences. This is about him, isn't it? Not a question. Vivian didn't answer. He came back 4 years ago, her mother said quietly. I knew. I suspected. But I didn't want to think about it too hard. You know how your father is? He'd have turned the money down. Mom, he was a proud man with nothing to be proud of for a long time. Ellen's voice was careful, factual. The consulting work gave him something back. I wasn't going to ask where it came from. You knew. I suspected. I chose not to look directly at it. She took a sip of tea. Maybe that was wrong. Maybe, Vivian said. Or maybe you just survived. She went inside, sat at the kitchen table, picked up her phone. She typed a message to the number she didn't have saved. Tomorrow. Somewhere neutral. You talk. I listen. No games. She hit send. 3 seconds later, the reply came back. Understood. But be aware. By tomorrow morning, the games may have already started, whether you're playing or not. Vivian set the phone down and pressed both palms flat on the kitchen table and looked at the grain of the wood and breathed. Tomorrow, Serena Falcone would tell her something. Tomorrow, the thing Dominic had been bracing for would arrive or it wouldn't. Tomorrow she would know whether the story she was standing inside was the kind she'd walked into knowing or the kind you don't recognize until you're already too deep to see the edges. Tonight, there was cake in the refrigerator from the night before, and her mother's birthday was 1 day away, and the water-stained bird was still on her ceiling, and somewhere across the city, in a glass-walled room above the harbor, a man was moving pieces on a board she couldn't see yet. She cut herself a slice of cake and ate it alone at the table and told herself she was still in control of this. Still just a visitor. Still capable of getting on that train Sunday evening and returning to the clean, quiet life in Boston that asked nothing of her heart. She almost believed it. Almost. Serena Falcone chose a diner. Not a restaurant, not a hotel lobby or a private room or any of the spaces where a woman with her kind of money and her kind of name might have been expected to conduct her business. A diner on Marsh Street called the Blue Anchor, the kind of place with laminated menus and coffee that had been sitting on the burner since 6 in the morning, and a counter waitress who called everyone honey without looking up. Vivian arrived at 8:45 and found Serena already in the back booth, both hands wrapped around a mug, watching the door. She was not what Vivian had expected. The voice on the phone had been polished. Corporate. The kind of smooth that money buys when it has time to practice. In person, Serena Falcone was sharp in a way that didn't match the polish. Sharp like something that had been ground down from a rougher original. She was maybe 35, dark-haired like her brother, dressed in a charcoal blazer over a plain black shirt. No jewelry except a watch. Eyes that moved quickly and settled slowly, cataloging, sorting. She looked at Vivian the way people look at things they've spent time preparing to see. Vivian sat down across from her. "You're exactly what I expected," Serena said. "I can't tell if that's good or bad." "It's neither. It's just, he described you a particular way and you're that way. It's almost inconvenient." The waitress came. Vivian ordered coffee. The waitress left. "You said you'd tell me the whole story," Vivian said. "I said he wouldn't." Serena turned her mug a quarter rotation. Back. "That's not quite the same thing." "Then what will you tell me?" "I'll tell you what I've watched for 4 years. Serena looked out the window at Marsh Street, where the morning was doing its ordinary work. Delivery trucks, a woman walking 2 dogs, a teenager on a bike who wasn't paying enough attention. "I'll tell you what it looks like from the inside when someone you love decides to carry everything alone because they've decided that asking for help is the same thing as showing weakness." "That sounds like an observation about your brother." "It's a warning about the pattern." She looked back. "Dominic doesn't do things small. He never has. When he decides something matters, he reorganizes everything around it. He did that with the family business. He did that with this city. He did that—" She stopped. "With you. And the question I've been asking for 2 years is whether what he built here is love or whether it's the same thing he does with every problem, which is to say, whether he solved you." The word landed hard. Vivian didn't let it show. "People aren't problems to be solved," she said. "No," Serena agreed, "but Dominic doesn't always know the difference." She took a drink of her coffee. "He's been working toward something. A transition. He's been trying to move the family's holdings into legitimate structures. Real estate, community development, clean capital. It's taken years and it's not finished, and it's fragile. The whole architecture of it is fragile because it depends on no one looking too closely too fast. And someone is looking. Someone has been looking." Serena set down the mug with precision. "Federal investigators have been building a case around the Falcone holdings for 3 years. Mostly they've been focused on the New York operations, the older structures that predate Dominic's push for legitimacy. But recently," she paused, "recently they've shifted focus to Ravenport, to the community development work, to certain financial flows that, if examined without context, could be characterized as money laundering through nonprofit vehicles." Vivian felt the cold settle in her stomach. Could be characterized. Context matters enormously. The money is clean. The projects are real. But a federal investigator with a theory and sufficient time can make clean things look complicated. She met Vivian's eyes. Especially if someone provides them with the right documents, the right framing, a map. Someone like you. The silence in the diner was the specific silence of something true being said out loud for the first time. "Why would you do that?" Vivian said. "He's your brother." "Because I'm afraid of what he's building." The sharpness in Serena's face cracked, just slightly, just enough to show something underneath it that was older and less composed. "Not the city, not the legitimate businesses. I'm afraid of what he's building around you, around this idea of you. He has been operating in a controlled, disciplined, forward-moving way for 4 years, and then you came back and walked into that lobby yesterday, and I watched it on the security feed, and he stood at that window for 11 minutes before he turned around." She pressed her thumb into the handle of the mug. 11 minutes. Dominic doesn't hesitate. He doesn't stand still. Something is going to break, and I would rather be the one who controls how it breaks. Vivian stared at her. "You want to blow up his life before he can make a decision you don't approve of. I want to force a conversation that he has been avoiding for 4 years. By going to federal investigators. By making the situation unstable enough that he can't manage it alone anymore. She said it flatly, with the terrible logic of someone who had decided that damage was preferable to silence. I love my brother, and I am watching him rebuild a prison and call it a home. Vivian sat back. The coffee in front of her was untouched and going cold. Outside on Marsh Street, the morning continued its indifferent progress. She thought about the 11 minutes. She thought about a man standing at a window with his back to the harbor. Have you already done it? She said. Serena's expression was the answer before her words were. Last night, she said, I sent documents to 2 journalists and 1 contact at the Financial Crimes Division. The documents are accurate. The framing I provided is selective. Selective. The context that would make the transactions understandable is not included. Vivian pressed her hands flat on the table, the same gesture she'd made the night before in her parents' kitchen, grounding herself, finding the surface. Then why are you telling me this? It's done. Whatever you set in motion is already moving. Because he doesn't know yet, Serena said. He'll know by this afternoon when the first journalist calls for comment. And when he knows, he will do what he always does. He will close ranks, activate lawyers, and try to manage it alone. And it will not occur to him to let you in. Why would it? I'm no one to him now. You are exactly not that, Serena said, and her voice was quiet for the first time since Vivian had sat down. Quiet in a way that felt more dangerous than the composed precision of everything before it. You are the only person in his life he has never been able to treat as a variable. That is why I'm afraid. That is why I did what I did. And that is why I'm telling you now, before he tries to make himself disappear into the problem. She pushed the coffee mug aside. He needs someone who won't let him. Vivian looked at her for a long time. The diner hummed around them. The counter, the coffee burner, the low specific noise of a room where people ate breakfast and didn't think about the kinds of conversations happening in the back booth. You love him, Vivian said. Differently than you do, Serena said. But yes. And you did this anyway. Sometimes love is the thing you do that the other person will hate you for. She stood, picked up her jacket from the seat beside her, left 2 20s on the table. He's going to need the records, the full context, the explanatory documents, the chain of ownership for every Ravenport project. If investigators are looking at this without context, he needs someone to build the context for them, quickly. That's not my job. I know. She buttoned the jacket, precise and economical. But you're the only person whose judgment he'll trust right now, even if he doesn't know it yet. She picked up her bag. His lawyers are good, but they think in liability. You think in evidence, in what things actually are versus how they appear. She looked at Vivian steadily. You've spent your career looking at damaged things and figuring out what they were before someone tried to obscure them. This is the same work. She walked out. The bell above the diner door rang once, and then the morning absorbed her. Vivian sat in the back booth and looked at the 2 20s on the table and the untouched cup of coffee and the empty seat across from her, and she thought about what it meant that Serena had come to her specifically, had sat here, and explained her own betrayal with the precision of a woman who had decided consequence was preferable to inaction. She thought about whether Serena was manipulating her. She thought about whether the manipulation was also true. She picked up her phone and called him. He answered on the second ring. She told you, he said. No greeting. She told me. A pause. She could hear him breathing, could hear the specific quality of a room going very still. Where are you? Blue Anchor on Marsh. Don't leave. He paused again. Please. She looked out the window at Marsh Street. I'll be here, she said. He arrived in 14 minutes. She knew because she counted the same way she'd counted the 40 seconds in the lobby the day before, the same way she'd been counting everything since she got off that train, measuring time the way you measure time when you're trying to feel like you have some control over it. He came in alone. No security in sight. He was still in the suit from the previous day, or one identical to it, and there was something about his face that was different from the afternoon before. The composure was there, but it was working harder now. You could see the effort of it. He slid into the booth across from her with the economy of a man who had been moving fast and was forcing himself to stop. He looked at her like he was checking that she was real. Talk, she said. Which part did she tell you? The journalists? The investigators? The documents? The framing? He absorbed this without visible reaction, but his jaw tightened once. The documents themselves are accurate. She told me. The framing she gave them isn't. She told me that too. Vivian looked at him directly. She said the context is missing, that the transactions look like money laundering without the ownership chain and the project history. Which is why my lawyers are—
Your lawyers think in liability, she said. I know. She told me that as well. Something moved across his face. Calculation and something else, something more complicated. She planned this very carefully. She loves you. She blew up 4 years of work. She's afraid of what you were building. He was quiet. The waitress came, looked at his face, left without asking. Smart woman.
What was I building? He said. The question came out careful. Too careful. The kind of careful that meant the answer mattered more than he wanted to show. She thinks you were building a life around an idea of me, Vivian said. A version of me that you've been carrying for 12 years, without ever testing whether the real one matches it. He looked at his hands on the table. Knuckles, tendons, the faint scar along his left index finger she'd always meant to ask about. She's not wrong, he said quietly. The honesty of it took the air out of the room for a second. No, Vivian said. She's probably not. But the work is real, he said. The city, the families, the projects. None of that is— I didn't do that to impress you. I wasn't even sure you'd ever see it. Then why? He looked up. Because I grew up in this city, and I watched what happened to it, and I had the means to do something about it, and I didn't do it for 20 years because I was too focused on consolidating power and protecting the business, and I was a coward about it. He said the last words with a flatness that meant he'd already made peace with them. Your family was the place I started because it was specific. It was the damage I could see most clearly, and then it kept going. Because once you start seeing it, you can't stop. Did you ever think about telling them? Telling my parents? Your father would have refused. Yes. And then he'd have nothing. The consulting work, the house, your mother's health. He shook his head once. I thought about it. I made the decision I made. Without asking. Yes. That's the part that— She stopped. The diner hummed. Someone at the counter laughed at something. That's the part that feels like control, Dominic. Even if the intention was different, you decided what they needed. You decided what was best. You built something around them without telling them, and now they're inside a structure they don't understand. I know. That's not okay. I know that too. So why did you do it that way? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said low, because asking means you might say no. And if you say no, then I can't do the thing. And if I can't do the thing, then the people I'm trying to help don't get help, and I've spent my whole life not being able to live with that. She held his gaze. Held the sentence. That's not love, she said carefully. That's a compulsion. Maybe. He didn't look away. Maybe it's both. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at it. A news alert. She read the headline once and felt the floor drop 6 inches. She turned the phone and showed it to him across the table. Exclusive. Federal sources. Say Ravenport developer Falcone used criminal wealth to secretly benefit ex-lover's family. Calls into question. Legitimacy of entire community development push. He read it. His expression didn't change. Not the smallest muscle. The discipline of that was staggering, and she hated it a little even as she understood it. That's the frame, she said. Yes. They're not calling it community development. They're calling it a personal enrichment scheme dressed as philanthropy. Yes. And your family. They're going to connect your family's history to every project in Ravenport. They already have, if the investigators have the documents Serena gave them. Can your lawyers contain it? He looked at the phone one more time, not quickly enough. She picked it up, put it face down on the table. What do you need? He looked at her. The first real look. Not the composed look or the careful look or the look of a man managing a situation. Just him, just his eyes, and something in them that was old and tired and trying very hard not to be desperate. I need the full documentation for every Ravenport project organized into a clear evidentiary record. Chain of ownership, funding sources, community benefit agreements, resident outcomes, independent audits. I have all of it. It's in storage. But it needs someone to build it into a coherent narrative that journalists and investigators can follow. Someone who reads evidence. Someone who knows what things actually are versus how they appear. She recognized her own words from Serena's mouth arriving in his without either of them knowing it. She wondered if Serena had planned that too. "How much time do we have," she said, "before this becomes unmanageable?" He thought. 48 hours. Maybe 72. "Where's the documentation?" "My office. 4th floor, not the penthouse, the project files." "I need access." "You'll have it." She picked up her jacket from the seat. "I'm still furious at you," she said, matter of fact, the way she'd say anything true. "About my parents. About the way you did all of this. We're not done having that conversation." "I know. But right now there are families in Ravenport whose housing situation could be destabilized if this narrative holds. So I'm going to set aside the personal conversation until the work is done." He watched her stand up. Something in his face was doing something complex and quiet. "You don't have to do this," he said. "No," she agreed. "I don't." She put on her jacket. "Come on, show me the files." The 4th floor was different from the penthouse. Functional, dense, the working architecture of a man who ran something real. Banks of filing cabinets, 2 large work tables covered in organized document stacks, a wall of shelves holding binders labeled by project name and year. Vivian stood in the middle of it and turned a slow circle and felt the particular alertness that came when she was confronted with a significant conservation problem. Something damaged that needed to be read correctly. Something whose true nature had been obscured. She asked for a legal pad and a pen. He found them. She started with the Harborview residential tower because it was the project most clearly implicated by the headline. She pulled the binder, opened it on the table, and began reading. He sat across from her and answered questions when she asked them and stayed out of her way when she didn't, and she would not have been able to say exactly when the morning tipped from practical work into something else, except that at some point she looked up from a document and found him looking at her with the same expression he'd had in the booth, the old, tired, unguarded one, and she looked back down without commenting. By noon they had rough outlines for 5 of the 12 major projects. By 2 in the afternoon, his phone had rung 11 times from numbers she assumed were lawyers and advisors and captains and people who ran the various parts of what he was, and he had answered 3 of them and given terse instructions and hung up. At 2:15, she found something. It was in the Ravenport Heritage Initiative files, buried in a supplementary funding document from 2021. A transaction record showing a transfer from Vellum Trust to the nonprofit's operating account. The amount was significant. The date was 3 weeks after Vivian's mother had her first cardiac event, the event that her mother had mentioned casually at dinner, as though it were old news, which for her it apparently was. She stared at the date. She stared at the amount. "This transfer," she said, 3 weeks after my mother's first cardiac episode. He was across the table. He looked at the document. He said nothing. "You knew," she said, "about the cardiac episode. I keep track of your family's welfare. I have contacts in the city. You were monitoring my family's medical situation. I was making sure they were okay." The distinction in his voice was real. He believed it was a distinction. "When I found out about your mother's heart, I increased the discretionary funding available through the initiative so the medical costs would be covered." Without telling her. Without telling her. Vivian set the document down, pressed both hands flat on the table, the gesture again, grounding herself. "Dominic, I need you to hear what this sounds like." "I know what it sounds like. It sounds like surveillance. It sounds like a man who has been monitoring people who don't know they're being monitored and making decisions about their lives based on information they never consented to share." "It sounds like that," he said. "Or it sounds like someone who cared about people and had the means to help and chose to help. Both can be true." "Yes." He held her gaze. "Both can be true." "That doesn't make the surveillance okay." "No." He said it evenly. "It doesn't." She picked the document back up and made a note on the legal pad and moved forward. She was getting good at moving forward. She had been getting good at it for 12 years. The question was whether she was moving forward or just moving. At 3:47, his phone rang, and this time he looked at it and went still. "I need to take this in the other room," he said. She kept reading. He was gone for 9 minutes. When he came back, he was a different temperature. Not colder exactly, but more compressed. Everything pulled tighter. "What happened?" she said. "One of my captains." He sat back down, picked up a pen, and set it down again. There are people in the organization's structure who view this news coverage as an opportunity. Some of them have been waiting for an opportunity. Rivals. Internal and external. He looked at the document stacks. There's going to be a meeting tonight. A lot of voices who have been quiet are going to be loud about what they think should happen next. What do they think should happen? They think I should stop the transition, stop the legitimacy push, liquidate the community holdings, and redirect the capital back into the traditional operations. He said it with the flatness of someone describing a weather forecast they'd been expecting. They think the Ravenport project has made me soft and the coverage proves it. Vivian looked at him. "What are you going to do?" "Tell them no. And if they push, they'll push." He met her eyes. "This has been coming for a while. The transition costs the organization in the short term. There are people who never believed in it. Tonight will be when that becomes formal. That sounds dangerous. It's not the first time. That's not actually reassuring." For the first time since the diner, something almost like a smile moved through his expression. Brief, real. "No, I suppose it isn't." She put down the legal pad, looked at the binders on the shelves, looked at him. "If they force the issue tonight, if they push hard enough, does the transition survive?" He was quiet for a moment. "If I'm still the one making the decisions, yes. If they succeed in moving against me," he stopped. "The projects survive. They're structured to survive independently. The community trust can function without my active participation. You built them to work without you. I built them to be real," he said simply, "not dependent on me staying alive or staying in charge." She heard what was inside that sentence and chose not to address it directly. "Then what do you need for tonight?" "To handle it myself." "That's not what I asked." He looked at her for a long moment. Outside the window, Ravenport was going about its afternoon, the ordinary machine of a city, grinding forward the way cities did. She thought about the cab driver on the first night. Eventually, all those names led back to the same one. She was all the way back to it now, sitting in a room full of documents that were someone's version of a decade of care, and the person across from her was looking at her like she was the only still point in something that was spinning. "I need this," he said quietly, indicating the documents. "I need this built into something coherent before the morning cycle, before the second wave of coverage." He paused. "And I need to know that when I come back from tonight's meeting, whatever happens, there's something to come back to." The sentence was as close to asking as she'd ever heard from him. She picked up the legal pad. "Then go to your meeting," she said. "I'll be here." He stood, buttoned his jacket, looked at her one more time with that expression she'd spent 12 years forgetting and was spending today relearning. "Vivian," he stopped. There's something I need to tell you about why I actually, about 12 years ago and what He stopped again. The control that never failed him was failing, just at the edges, just barely. "Tonight," she said firmly, cutting off whatever was about to fall apart in this room at 4 p.m. with 48 hours until the story became unmanageable. "Tell me tonight." He nodded, walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame and his back to her. "The scar on my hand," he said, without turning. "The one on my index finger. You always meant to ask about it." She stared at his back. "I got it the night you left," he said. "The night you got on that bus. I put my hand through a window." He paused. "Not the dramatic kind. I wasn't watching where I was walking. I was looking at the bus until I couldn't see it anymore, and I walked straight into a glass door." He left. She sat in the room with the documents and the late afternoon light and the sound of the city below and the image of a 22-year-old boy walking into a glass door because he was watching a bus disappear. She picked up the pen. She started to build the record. 2 hours later, her phone lit up with a news alert that made the first one look gentle. This one had names. This one had photographs. This one had a quote attributed to sources close to a federal investigation
that described Dominic Falcone's community development work in Ravenport as a sophisticated financial concealment scheme designed to protect criminal assets while creating a false narrative of legitimate philanthropy.
And at the bottom of the article, in a line that landed like a door closing, sources also indicate that among those who may have knowingly benefited from the scheme is Vivian Mercer, an art conservator based in Boston and former associate of Mr. Falcone, whose family received significant undisclosed financial benefits over a 2-year period. Her name, in print, in a federal investigation story. She read it once, read it again. Then she set the phone face down on the table, picked up the pen, and kept writing. That was the thing she noticed about herself later, when she had distance on it, that her first response to seeing her own name in a federal investigation story was not panic, not flight, not the particular cold freeze of a person whose life was about to change. Her first response was to pick up the pen and keep building the record. 12 years of careful, deliberate work had trained her hands to move toward the damaged thing, not away from it. Her hands didn't know how to do anything else. She worked for 40 minutes after the alert. Then she stopped. She picked up the phone and read the article 3 times, slowly, the way she read conservation reports, looking for the load-bearing sentences, the places where the structure of the argument actually rested. The quote from federal sources. The photograph of Dominic outside what she recognized as the Harborview Tower. A secondary photograph, grainy, clearly pulled from a professional profile of her. Her name in the 4th paragraph and again in the 7th. Former associate. The careful legal distance of that phrase. Former associate. She called Marisol. I saw it, Marisol said before Vivian could speak. My name is in a federal investigation story. I know. Marisol. I know, Viv. I'm looking at it right now. A pause. The sound of a chair moving. Marisol settling in, which meant she was shifting into the mode Vivian had watched her use for 15 years. The journalist's mode, clear-eyed, triage-oriented. Okay, first question. Did you know about any of this before you arrived in Ravenport? No. You're certain? I got here Thursday night for my mother's birthday. I found out about the financial structure on Friday by doing property records research on my own. I've had no prior knowledge of any transactions involving my family. Can you document your timeline? I can document everything. I've been building the evidentiary record all afternoon. Another pause. You've been building his defense. I've been building the truth, which happens to also be his defense. Vivian. Marisol's voice shifted. Not harder. More careful. I need you to hear what I'm about to say as your friend, not as someone judging your choices. Are you hearing me? Yes? You are currently named in a federal investigation story inside the apartment of the man the story is about, building documents that could be characterized as obstruction of justice if anyone decides to look at it that way. The room was very quiet. I'm aware, Vivian said. Are you aware that you need a lawyer before you do another single thing? She hadn't thought about that. She'd been thinking about the documents, about the record, about the 48 hours. She hadn't thought about herself as a person with legal exposure. I know a lawyer in Boston, she said. Call them, right now, before you touch another document. A pause. And Vivian? Where's he? He's at a meeting. What kind of meeting? The kind you have when your organization is in crisis and certain people want to use the crisis. Internal, Marisol said flatly. He's at an internal power meeting while you're alone in his office building his case. Yes. The silence on the line had a particular texture. Call the lawyer, Marisol said. I love you. Call the lawyer now. She hung up. Vivian sat for a moment. The legal pad was in front of her, 3 pages covered in her handwriting. Project names, dates, funding flows, cross-references. Good work. Accurate work. Work that told the true story of 12 Ravenport projects in enough detail that anyone willing to read it would understand what had actually been built here. She looked at it and felt for the first time since the morning something that was adjacent to fear, not fear of consequences. Fear of the simpler thing. The thing Marisol had put her finger on without quite saying it. The thing about what it meant that she was here, in this room, doing this work, while he was somewhere else managing his world. The thing about whether the patterns Serena had described, The man who decided what people needed and built it for them without asking had already taken her in. She had told herself she was choosing this. She had told herself it was her decision, her skills, her judgment about where the work needed to happen. And maybe that was true. But she was also sitting alone in his building, building his record, with her name in a federal story, while he handled the parts he'd decided she didn't need to be involved in. She picked up her phone and called the Boston lawyer. The lawyer's name was Diane Chen, and she had been Vivian's occasional counsel on contract disputes for 6 years, and she was, by temperament and training, one of the least alarmist people Vivian had ever met. Diane Chen looked at every situation with the same level expression and sorted it into categories: problem, manageable problem, serious problem, call me immediately. After 5 minutes of listening, she said, "This is a serious problem." "Okay." Being named as a potential beneficiary in a federal financial investigation, even without any allegation of active wrongdoing, creates exposure, especially if you are currently in possession of documents related to the investigation. "I'm building an evidentiary record to demonstrate that the transactions were legitimate." A pause. "For whom?" "For the projects, for the record." "Vivian, are you doing this for Dominic Falcone?" She looked at the legal pad. "I'm doing it because the families in those housing projects deserve to have the truth documented before a false narrative becomes the official version." "That's a very good answer," Diane said, "and I believe you mean it. But I need you to understand that from a legal exposure standpoint, it makes no difference why you're building the record. What matters is that you are, and that you're doing it while named in coverage of a federal investigation involving the man whose documents you're using." She paused. "Stop working on the documents. Don't take anything out of that building. Don't communicate with federal investigators without counsel present. And tell me, have you been contacted directly by anyone from law enforcement?" "No." "If you are, you say nothing. You say my name and you stop talking." She paused. "And Vivian, I need to ask you something directly." "Go ahead." "Is there any possibility, any at all, that you had prior knowledge of the financial arrangements involving your family? Even something you heard and didn't pay attention to? Something someone might have told you years ago?" The question was clean and professional, and it landed like something cold. "No," she said. "You're certain?" "I am completely certain." "Good," Diane said, "because that's the question they'll ask you. And the answer has to be what you just told me, and it has to be true." A pause. "Where are you right now?" "His office building, 4th floor. I'd strongly recommend not being there when he gets back from wherever he is." Vivian looked around the room. The shelves, the binders, the work tables, the 3 pages of her handwriting on the legal pad, the late afternoon light that had gone amber while she'd been working. "I hear you," she said. "This may get significantly more complicated before it gets simpler," Diane said. "I want you to be prepared for that." "I'm prepared." "Do you need me to come to Ravenport?" "Not yet." She paused. "But stay close." She hung up. She stood up from this table, and she did the hardest thing she'd done since she sat down. She picked up the legal pad and left it exactly where it was, and she did not take it with her. 3 pages of good work, accurate work, work that could help clarify the truth, and she left it sitting on the table because her lawyer had told her to stop, and because she was trying, for the first time since she'd arrived in this city, to make a decision that was entirely her own. She walked to the elevator and pressed the button and stood in the polished steel door's reflection and looked at herself. Dark jacket, dark hair, the face of a woman who had arrived in this city for a birthday weekend and was now named in a federal story and standing in a building that didn't have a sign. And she said quietly to the reflection, "You should have stayed on the train." The elevator came. She got in. The doors closed. Her phone buzzed as the elevator descended. A text from an unknown number, different from Serena's. She read it once. "Miss Mercer, we'd like to speak with you at your convenience regarding your relationship with Dominic Falcone and your family's financial history. No obligation at this stage. We can meet anywhere you're comfortable. Essa Reeves, Financial Crimes Division." She read it again. The elevator opened into the lobby. She walked out into the evening air of Ravenport and stood on the sidewalk near the harbor and looked at the text and thought about Diane saying, stopped talking and thought about Serena saying, "I sent documents to a contact at the Financial Crimes Division," and thought about her father saying, "I keep waiting for it to fall apart." She texted Diane a screenshot of the message. Then she started walking. Not toward her parents' house, not toward any destination, just moving because standing still was impossible, and the city was right there, breathing around her, the city that had been remade by the same hands that had made this mess. And she walked until she found herself standing in front of the art center in the old garment factory, with its warm lights and its ceramic studio and its second-floor paintings, and she stopped. A woman inside was throwing clay on a wheel. Through the glass, Vivian could see the concentration on her face, the wet clay rising, the specific focus of someone making something real out of something that started as dirt. Her phone rang. Dominic. She answered. "I left your office." "I know, my assistant told me." A pause. She could hear noise behind him. Voices, a door, the particular acoustic of a large room. "Are you okay?" "A federal agent texted me." Silence. Then, "Don't respond to it. Get a lawyer." "I have one. She told me to leave your building." "Your lawyer is correct." His voice was tight. Whatever room he was in was generating pressure she could feel through the phone. "I'm sorry, I didn't. Your exposure wasn't something I. Dominic." She watched the woman through the glass. The clay was rising now, finding its shape. "What's happening at the meeting?" A pause. "It's complicated." "Tell me." Not over the phone. "Then tell me when you're done." She pressed her free hand against the cold glass of the window. "I'm not leaving Ravenport tonight. I need to talk to you face to face, but not in your building." "My parents' house," he said. "It's on Kessler Street. No one would. It's off the operational map. It's just a house." "Text me the address." She hung up. The address came through 30 seconds later. She looked at it. A residential street 2 miles from the harbor, in a neighborhood she didn't know. A house, he'd said. Just a house. She started walking. But the house on Kessler Street was a federal-style double that had been standing since the 1890s and looked it. Not neglected, but aged in the way of things that had been tended carefully without being altered. The porch light was on. There were no cars in the driveway. She rang the bell and no one answered, which she had expected, and then she tried the door and it opened, which she had not. She stepped into the front hall and stood still for a moment. Dark wood floors. Old furniture. Good quality. Decades old. The smell of a house that had been empty for a few hours. Not abandoned, just waiting. Family photographs on the hallway wall, and she made herself not look at them. She found the kitchen and sat at the table and waited. He arrived 43 minutes later. She heard the front door and then his footsteps in the hall, and then he was in the kitchen doorway, still in the suit, jacket open, and something about his face had changed in a way she couldn't immediately categorize. He looked like a man who had just done something that couldn't be undone, which she was about to learn he had. "Tell me," she said. He sat down across from her. His hands were on the table, flat, the way she put her hands on tables when she needed grounding. The parallel of it was not lost on her. "There was a vote tonight," he said. "A vote on what?" "On whether I should continue leading the organization." She went still. "And?" "It was close." He looked at his hands. "Closer than I expected. 8-5 in my favor. Among the 12 senior captains, 4 abstained, which in practice means they're watching which way it goes before they commit." He looked up. "Marco Vellante led the opposition. He's been my second in New York for 9 years." What was his argument? That the Ravenport transition has cost the organization 15% of operating revenue over 4 years. That the federal exposure created by the coverage today is a direct result of what he calls my personal sentimentality. That a leader whose decisions can be predicted and exploited by his own sister has lost the authority to lead. He said it evenly, the way you recite facts you've accepted. He also said, and this is the part that isn't clean, that he has documentation of transactions from the early years of my leadership, before the legitimacy push. Transactions that are genuinely problematic, not the Ravenport work. Older things. What kind of things? He was quiet for a moment. The kitchen was very still. "The kind of things," he said, "that if added to what Serena already gave the investigators, would make the case significantly harder to defend. Not impossible, but the kind of exposure that would make any prosecutor's day. She looked at him across the table. Vellante is threatening to give additional documents to federal investigators. If I don't step back from the transition and return to traditional operations, he's blackmailing you. He's negotiating. A pause. In our world, the line between those things is administrative. What did you tell him? He met her eyes. I told him no. The silence after that had weight. He'll do it, she said. Probably. So by tomorrow morning, investigators may have both what Serena gave them and whatever Vellante has. Yes. And your legal exposure goes from complex to significant, he said. She pressed her hands flat on the table. The gesture, again, her hands finding the surface. Dominic, when you told me this would take 48 hours to manage, that was before tonight. Yes. What does it take now? He was quiet for long enough that the kitchen clock became audible. An old clock, mechanical, the kind that ticked. Honestly? He looked at her, really looked. The composed man, the careful man, the man who had been managing situations for 20 years was sitting across a kitchen table from her and looking at her like someone who had run out of managed positions. I don't know. She had never heard him say those 3 words in that order. There's something else, he said. Tell me. Vellante said something at the end of the meeting, after the vote, when people were leaving. He came to me privately. He stopped. His jaw worked once. He said that your name being in the coverage wasn't an accident. She felt something drop in her chest. What do you mean? He said the source that gave your name to the journalist, the source that characterized you as a knowing beneficiary, wasn't from Serena's documents. Serena's documents didn't include your name. She told you the documents were accurate and the framing was selective, and that's true. But your name specifically, the characterization of you as complicit, came from a different source. The kitchen clock ticked. Vellante, she said. He wanted leverage. Your name in the story gives him leverage over me. He said it flatly, with no inflection at all, which was worse than anger would have been. He knew that if you were implicated, I would... He stopped. You would what? He looked at her. Make decisions based on protecting you rather than protecting the organization. She absorbed this, the whole shape of it. Serena, who had blown up her brother's legitimacy push out of love and fear. Vellante, who had inserted Vivian's name into a federal story to use her as a lever against the man she was sitting across from. And Dominic, who had spent 2 years building a city around a woman he'd never asked to stay, and who now had his own second using that fact as a weapon. She thought about Serena's words in the diner. Whether he solved you. She thought about Diane Chen saying serious problem. She thought about her father saying, I keep waiting for it to fall apart. I need to know something, she said, and her voice came out steady, which surprised her. And I need you to tell me the truth. Yes. The transactions Vellante has, the older ones, the pre-legitimacy ones, are they what he says they are? He didn't look away. Some of them. Which means if they reach investigators, combined with what Serena provided and the framing already in the media, yes. He held her gaze. It becomes a federal case with sufficient probable cause for charges. Against you. Against me and potentially others in the organization. A pause. Not against you. Your exposure is collateral and manageable. Diane Chen will have you clear in 2 weeks once the actual record is established. I'm not asking about my exposure. I know. I'm asking whether you are looking at a federal indictment. He was quiet for 3 seconds. Possibly. She stood up from the table. She needed to move. She crossed to the kitchen window and looked out at the backyard. A dark square of garden, an old tree she couldn't identify, a wooden fence. Ordinary, quiet. The backyard of a house where someone had grown up. She turned around. You have to give them the record, she said, voluntarily, not through lawyers as a defensive maneuver. You, directly. You go to the investigators and you lay it all out. The Ravenport projects, the funding sources, the community benefit outcomes, everything. Full cooperation. You control the narrative before Vellante can deliver his. Voluntary cooperation in a federal investigation doesn't protect me from the older transactions. No. But it changes the posture. It changes what you look like. It demonstrates that the Ravenport work is what you say it is. which isolates Volante's material as the opposition move it actually is. She crossed her arms. Her voice was sharper than she intended. And it is the right thing to do, independently of the strategy. Vivian, you built something real here. She heard her own voice, didn't soften it. You built something real, and you built it the right way, and you built it without taking credit for it, which means the record exists somewhere, and it is true, and it needs to be the version that stands. You don't get to let Volante bury it because you're afraid of what comes next for you personally. He looked at her from across the kitchen. The old clock ticked. Outside, Ravenport was dark and quiet and going about its night. If I do this, he said slowly, it becomes a public record. Everything. My history with this organization. What I did before the transition. What I did to build the capital that funded all of it. Everything the Ravenport work was built on top of. Yes. It changes what I am in the public record permanently. Yes. You understand that means what I've been building toward, the legitimate version of this. It survives, but the man at the center of it is on record as what you actually were, she said, before you became what you're trying to be. The silence was long. And you? He said. His voice was very quiet. After all of this, after your name in the story, after this weekend, after... He stopped. What do you do with all of this? She looked at him across the kitchen of the house where he'd grown up, in the city she'd left, in the middle of a situation she had walked into without understanding its weight, and she felt the full complexity of it pressing against her from all sides. The love that was real, and the control that was also real, and the man who had never learned to simply ask, and the woman who had never learned to simply stay, and 12 years of silence that had apparently not been silence at all. I don't know yet, she said. That's new, he said. An echo of the diner, an echo of themselves. This is new, she said. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A news alert. She read the headline and went completely still. She turned the phone and showed it to him. Breaking. Second source provides federal investigators with Falcone financial records. Criminal charges expected within 48 hours. Sources say key witness has agreed to cooperate. He read it. Read it again. Volante didn't wait, she said. No. His voice was flat as stone. He didn't. She looked at the headline again. Key witness has agreed to cooperate. Not Volante himself. A witness. Someone inside the organization who had already flipped, already agreed, already sitting across a table from federal agents before tonight's meeting had even ended. Which meant tonight's meeting hadn't been a negotiation. It had been theater. The decision had been made before anyone sat down. She looked up at him. This was never a negotiation. No, he said. His voice was very quiet. It wasn't. He's been building this for how long? He looked at the phone, at the headline, at the words criminal charges expected within 48 hours, and something moved across his face. Not fear, not anger, but something older and more fundamental. The particular expression of a person who has just understood that the ground they were standing on had been gone for a long time, and he simply hadn't known it yet. He moved first, not fast, not the explosive movement of a man in a crisis film, just a deliberate economical pushback from the table, standing, already reaching for his phone with the particular efficiency of someone who had run emergencies before and knew that the first 30 seconds mattered more than the next 30 minutes. He dialed before he was fully upright. She watched him put the phone to his ear and wait through one ring, two, and then a voice answered and he said, "It's done. Get Harlan on the phone and get the documents to him tonight. All of it. The Ravenport files, the ownership chain, the community benefit records, everything in the fourth floor storage. Tell him it's voluntary disclosure, full cooperation, and I want to be sitting in front of whoever is running this investigation by 9 tomorrow morning." A pause. "I don't care what time it is. Do it now." He hung up. He looked at her across the kitchen. "You were right," he said, "about voluntary disclosure. I know. I'm not doing it because it's strategic. I know that too." He put the phone in his jacket pocket. "I need to make 2 more calls. Then I need to go." "Go where?" "There are 3 properties in the east side that Volante's people could move against tonight if they think the organization's structure is unstable. I need to make sure they're secured." He said it the way he said everything operational. Flat, precise, already 3 steps ahead. Not violently, just present, bodies I trust, holding positions. And Vellante himself? He's made his move. He's not going to do anything tonight that jeopardizes his cooperation agreement. A pause. He wants me indicted, not in a hospital. She crossed her arms. There's a difference in your world between those two things. Yes, and right now that difference is the only thing I'm counting on. He looked at her, really looked. The kitchen was the same. The old clock, the wooden table, the dark garden outside the window. But something in the air of it had shifted, the way air shifts when a decision has been made that can't be taken back. You should go to your parents. I'm aware. Not because I want you to, because there's nothing you can do here tonight that helps, and being here when things get operational. I know. She uncrossed her arms. Let them fall. Looked at him standing in the kitchen of his parents' house in a suit with a phone in his pocket and a federal indictment building in a government office somewhere across the city. And she thought about everything she'd discovered in 4 days and everything she still didn't understand. And she said, the letter. He went still. You said there was a letter, yesterday, in the penthouse. You said there were things you needed to tell me. She held his gaze. The letter, Dominic, whatever it is, tell me before you walk out of this room. He looked at her for a long moment. His jaw moved once. The calculation ran across his face and then stopped. Stopped because he made it stop, visibly, a man deciding not to calculate. Tomorrow, he said, when this is done. You said that yesterday. I mean it this time. His voice was quiet. I need you to still be here tomorrow for it to matter. She looked at him. Thought about getting on a train Sunday evening. Thought about the clean, quiet life in Boston. Thought about the bird-shaped water stain. I'll be here, she said. He walked out of the kitchen. She heard the front door open and close. She stood alone in the kitchen of the house where he'd grown up and listened to the old clock tick and breathed. Then she picked up her phone and called her mother and said she was on her way home. She didn't sleep. Not really. She lay in the room with the water-stained bird and watched the ceiling and listened to Ravenport breathe outside the window. Sirens twice, distant, the particular nighttime sound of a city that was mostly quiet but never completely. And she turned the shape of things over and over until the turning stopped producing new information and became just movement for its own sake. At 5:43, she got up. She showered, she dressed. She went downstairs and made coffee in her parents' kitchen, the new kitchen with its solid countertops, and she stood at the window while it brewed and looked at Carver Street in the early light. Her mother came down at 6:15, saw Vivian at the window. Didn't say anything immediately, poured herself a cup of the coffee and stood beside her daughter, and they both looked at the street. You didn't sleep, her mother said. No. Is it bad? Vivian thought about the federal story, about her name in the 4th paragraph, about Diane Chen saying serious problem, and about Vellante's cooperation agreement, and about 48 hours that were already 30 hours gone. It's complicated. Does it involve Dominic Falcone? She looked at her mother. Ellen Mercer was looking at the street, both hands around her mug, her face doing the particular thing it did when she already knew the answer to the question she was asking and was just waiting for someone to say it out loud. Yes, Vivian said. Are you safe? Yes. Is he? She thought about that. He's trying to be. Ellen nodded once, slowly. He fixed the house, she said. I know you know. I know your father doesn't know the full story yet, but I've known for about a year. She took a drink of coffee. When I was in the hospital, the second time, the serious one, there was a woman from the billing department who came to my room and told me there'd been an error in the insurance processing and that my bills were fully covered. She had papers. Everything looked right. I signed them. And you knew it wasn't the insurance. I knew something was off. I chose to sign them. She looked at Vivian. That's a choice I made. Every time something happened, the house, the kitchen, your father's job, I made the choice not to look too hard, because we were okay finally. We were okay. Her voice was steady. And I knew that if I looked too hard, I would find something that would make your father feel diminished, and I wasn't going to let that happen. Vivian looked at her mother for a long time. He should have asked. Yes. Ellen held her gaze. He should have. But I'm 60 years old and I've watched a lot of people love badly because they didn't know how to love well. And I'll tell you something, bad love that actually shows up is rarer than people pretend. She turned back to the window. What are you going to do? I don't know yet. You do know, her mother said. You just haven't decided whether it's the smart thing. Vivian looked at her coffee. Maybe it isn't the smart thing. Smart things are very boring, her mother said, with a serenity that shouldn't have been funny and was anyway. Drink your coffee. Something is going to happen today, and you need to be awake for it. Her phone buzzed on the counter. Dominic. A text. Meeting with investigators set for 9 a.m. Harlan has the files. I need you there. She stared at the text. Then, not as a witness, as the person who built the record. Harlan needs someone who can explain the documentation clearly. He needs you. Another pause, then a third message, which was the one that was different from the others, different from any message she'd ever gotten from him because it didn't manage or direct or calculate. I need you. She set the phone down on the counter, picked up her coffee, drank it, set it down. I have to go, she said. Her mother nodded like she'd been waiting for it. Harlan Doyle was 62, silver-haired, and radiated the specific energy of a man who had spent 40 years being the smartest person in very difficult rooms and had made a kind of peace with it. He met Vivian in the lobby of his firm's Ravenport office at 8:15 and looked at the legal pad she was carrying and said simply, "Good, walk me through it." She walked him through it for 30 minutes. The project files, the ownership chain, the funding flows, the community benefit outcomes. He asked 8 questions, all of them sharp, all of them the right questions. She answered 7 of them with certainty and told him she needed to pull an additional document for the 8th. The 8th one matters, he said. I know, give me 20 minutes. He gave her his assistant's computer and she spent 19 minutes locating the supplementary funding document she needed in the digital archive Dominic's office had given her access to the day before. She found it, printed it, walked it back to Harlan. He read it, nodded once. This establishes the community benefit agreement predates the federal investigation timeline by 16 months, he said. That's significant. That's the point. You built this record yourself? Started it yesterday, incomplete, but the structure is right. He looked at her over his glasses. You're not a lawyer. No. You're his... He stopped, sorted whatever he'd been about to say into a different category. You have conservation training. 12 years of it. You read damaged material and figure out what it actually is. Yes? He took the legal pad. Sit down. We have 40 minutes. What? The federal building was 6 blocks from Harlan's office, and they walked it because Harlan believed in walking to difficult meetings. Vivian walked beside him and felt the morning air on her face and thought about the train she was supposed to be getting on this evening and the life in Boston that was presumably still there, waiting for her, unchanged. The clean, quiet life. She had packed for 2 days. She was wearing the same jacket she'd arrived in. Dominic was already there in the lobby, with 2 other lawyers she didn't recognize. He was in a different suit from the night before, dark gray, and he looked like he had slept approximately as much as she had, which was to say, not enough. When he saw her, he went through something in his face that he managed to mostly contain. Mostly. You came, he said. I came. You didn't have to. Harlan needed the documentation explained. I built it. It was efficient. He held her gaze. Right. Don't, she said quietly, so only he could hear. I'm not doing anything. You're looking at me like that. I'll stop. He didn't stop, but she let it go. The meeting room was on the 4th floor and held 2 federal investigators. A supervising agent named Reeves, the same S.A. Reeves who had texted her the night before, a prosecutor she didn't catch the name of, and a stenographer. The room was the particular gray of government interiors, the kind of gray that was not chosen so much as accumulated. She sat against the wall behind Harlan, not at the table, observer positioning, and watched Dominic sit across from the investigators and put his hands flat on the table. Mr. Falcone, Reeves said, you've requested this meeting voluntarily. I have. You understand you have the right to counsel present? My counsel is present. He gestured at Harlan. Let's begin. What followed was 3 hours that Vivian would later describe to Marisol as the most concentrated exercise in watching a person choose transparency she had ever witnessed. Dominic answered every question Reeves asked him directly and without deflection. When a question touched on the pre-legitimacy operations, the older transactions, the years before the transition, he answered those too. He did not minimize. He did not perform contrition. He stated facts with the same flat precision he used for everything else. And when Harlan occasionally touched his arm, indicating a question deserved consultation before answering, Dominic consulted and then answered. Vivian sat against the wall and listened and watched and built a picture of a man she hadn't known she was building a picture of. The years he described, the early years, the consolidation years, the years when the Falcone name meant something specific in certain conversations, she had known the edges of them. She had not known the interior. She was learning it now, in a government room with gray walls from the man himself, who was choosing to say it out loud with a stenographer recording every word. At the 90-minute mark, Reeves set down his pen. Mr. Falcone, the Ravenport Community Development Projects, the housing, the commercial development, the neighborhood reinvestment. Our initial characterization of those transactions was incorrect, Dominic said. I know that. That's why I'm here. You're asking us to recharacterize the Ravenport work based on the documentation your attorney has provided. I'm asking you to look at what it actually is, Dominic said, which is what it appears to be. Real projects, real outcomes, real families, the money that funded them. Yes, some of it came from operations I can no longer defend. That's also in the record. But the projects themselves are clean and they need to stay intact. Reeves looked at him. That's an unusual priority for someone in your position. Those families didn't do anything wrong, Dominic said. Whatever happens to me, those projects should stand. Silence in the room. The stenographer's fingers paused. Vivian pressed her back against the wall and breathed. At 2 hours 40 minutes, Reeves picked up a file from the side of the table. We've been made aware of a second source who has provided documentation regarding your activities prior to 2019. That source has entered into a cooperation agreement. Volante, Dominic said. I can't confirm. It's Volante. I know. He held Reeves's gaze. What he's given you is real. I'm not going to tell you it isn't. What I will tell you is that his motivation for giving it to you has nothing to do with justice and everything to do with a power move inside a criminal organization, and I'm happy to document that as well. We're aware of the internal organizational dynamics. Then you know that his cooperation isn't altruistic. Cooperation rarely is, Reeves said. A pause. He looked at the file, then back up. Mr. Falcone, the question before us is what exposure you're looking at and what form a resolution might take. Your voluntary cooperation is a material factor. The nature of the Ravenport work is a material factor. He leaned back. We're going to need time to review the documentation your counsel has provided. How much time? 24 hours minimum. Dominic nodded once. There's one more thing, he said. Reeves waited. The woman whose name appeared in yesterday's coverage. He said it without looking at Vivian, without changing his posture or his tone, with the same flat precision he used for everything else. Vivian Mercer. Her characterization as a knowing beneficiary is false, and it was placed deliberately by the same source who provided your secondary documentation. I want that on the record. Mr. Falcone. It's on the record, Harlan said quietly from beside him. Reeves looked at Vivian against the wall. She met his gaze and said nothing, because Diane Chen had told her to say nothing, and she had exactly enough discipline left to follow that instruction. We'll be in touch, Reeves said. Outside the federal building, in the flat afternoon light of downtown Ravenport, Dominic stood on the sidewalk and let out a breath that she could see him deciding to let out. A controlled release, the exhale of a man reminding himself to be a body. His lawyers clustered briefly, exchanged information, dispersed. Harlan shook Vivian's hand, told her the record she'd built was excellent work, walked to his car. She stood on the sidewalk 6 feet from Dominic and waited. He turned to her. His face was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. It's done, she said. It started, he corrected. The 24 hours, the review, whatever they decide. What do you think they'll decide? He looked at the building behind her. There will be charges, the pre-legitimacy transactions are documented, and I acknowledged them. Harlan thinks we can negotiate the scope. Cooperation credit. The Ravenport work helps. He paused. It won't be nothing. No. But it's accurate. Whatever happens, the record is accurate. He looked at her. That's what you said. That the record has to be the version that stands. Yes. I listened to you. I know. A cab went by. A woman walked past with headphones on. Ordinary afternoon, ordinary city, the world going about itself around two people standing on a sidewalk having a conversation that was about much more than what the words said. The letter, she said. He looked at her. You keep deferring it. Tonight. Tomorrow. When this is done. She met his gaze. This is as done as it's going to be today. So tell me about the letter. He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket, inner pocket, the breast pocket she hadn't paid attention to, and withdrew a folded envelope, white, creased along 3 parallel lines that said it had been folded and unfolded many times over many years. He held it for a second, then he held it out to her. She looked at it, didn't take it yet. I wrote it the night you left, he said. The bus station. I went home and I wrote it, and I sealed it, and I kept it. A pause. I've thought about sending it probably 200 times. Why didn't you? Because I didn't know what I wanted the answer to be. He held it steady, the envelope between them, 12 years in a piece of paper. And because by the time I knew what I wanted the answer to be, I'd already done all of this. He gestured, vague and encompassing, meaning the city, the projects, the whole architecture of what he'd built. And I was afraid that if you read it, you'd see it as manipulation, as setup, as another version of deciding what you needed. She looked at the envelope. Her name was on the front in his handwriting, 12 years old, the ink slightly faded. Vivian. Just that. She took it. She didn't open it. She held it with both hands and looked at it and felt the weight of 12 years and 4 days and the particular density of things that had been kept. Serena called it a prison, she said. What you were building. I know. Is she wrong? He thought about it. She respected that he thought about it rather than answering immediately. She's wrong about the intention, he said. She might be right about the result. His voice was quiet. I built something that I thought was for other people. And some of it was. The city, the projects. Those are real and they're for the people who live in them. But the reason I started here, in this city, rebuilding from this specific corner, he stopped. Say it, she said. I started here because I couldn't figure out how to be somewhere else. He met her eyes. I came back because I couldn't make myself not. I ran the organization from New York for 8 years, and I was good at it, and I was completely empty. And I came back here because... He stopped again. His jaw moved. Because this is where you were from. Even when you weren't here, this is the place where you still existed in the version of the world I could tolerate living in. The sidewalk was solid under her feet. The city was around her. His face was in front of her, tired and open in a way she had never seen it, the composure fully gone, just him standing there, having said the true thing. She thought about her mother saying, bad love that actually shows up is rarer than people pretend. She thought about Serena saying he is the only person in his life he has never been able to treat as a variable. She looked down at the envelope. Her name on it, 12 years old, waiting. She looked back up. I need to read this alone, she said. I know. And then we need to have the actual conversation. Not managed, not deferred, the real one. Yes. She put the envelope in her jacket pocket, felt the rectangle of it against her ribs. Where will you be? Here. He meant the city. He meant he wasn't going anywhere. He meant something else underneath both of those things that she didn't need him to say because she could already hear it. She turned and walked. Not away. She was done with away. Toward her parents' house, toward the room with the water-stained bird, toward the quiet that would let her open an envelope and read 12 years of the things she'd been calling indifference and learning day by day in this city was nothing of the kind. She was half a block away when she heard him call her name. She stopped but didn't turn. Whatever the letter says, he called. His voice was steady and rough and carrying across the afternoon like something that had needed to travel a long distance. The answer I was afraid of knowing. I know it now. She stood still. I want you to stay, he said. She held the envelope against her ribs with one hand inside her jacket, felt her own heartbeat against it. She didn't answer yet. She kept walking, but she did not walk toward the train station. She walked toward home, which was not Boston, which she had known since approximately the moment she stepped off the train 4 days ago and smelled the river and the diesel and the particular unnamed something that was older than both. And the envelope was in her pocket and the letter was inside it. And somewhere across the city, a man was standing on a sidewalk watching her go, and for the first time in 12 years, he had stopped building things around her absence and simply said the true thing out loud. She was half a mile from Carver Street when her phone rang. She looked at it. Expected Dominic, expected Harlan or Diane or Marisol. It was a number she didn't recognize, local area code. She answered, Ms. Mercer. A man's voice. Calm, unhurried, the particular calm of someone who hadn't had to hurry in a long time. My name is Carlo Vellante, Marco's father. A pause. I believe you've become quite important to a situation I've been watching develop, and I think it would be worth your time to hear some things that my son neglected to tell the federal investigators this morning. Another pause. Brief, precise. Things about how this situation actually started, and who made the first call to whom. His voice didn't change pitch or temperature. Ms. Mercer, the cooperation agreement my son signed this morning protects him from prosecution. It does not protect him from the truth. A pause. And the truth, I'm afraid, is considerably more complicated than what anyone in that room heard today. She stopped walking. The city was around her, ordinary and alive, the Ravenport that had been remade block by block. The city breathing in the late afternoon, families in their houses, lights coming on in windows, the ordinary weight of real lives in real places built on a foundation that someone had decided was worth building on. She stood on the sidewalk with the phone against her ear and Carlo Vellante's voice in it, and she made a decision in approximately 4 seconds. The kind of decision that looks fast from the outside and is actually the product of everything that has happened in the preceding 4 days, compressed into a single point of clarity. Where? She said. He named a restaurant on the north side, a place called Antonelli's that had been open since 1971 and smelled like garlic and old wood and the particular density of a room that had absorbed decades of difficult conversations. Carlo Vellante was already seated when she arrived. A man in his late 70s, compact, white-haired, wearing a cardigan over a collared shirt with the careful precision of someone who had long ago decided that appearance was a form of argument. He stood when she came in. Old manners. She noted it without being moved by it. She sat down, didn't take off her jacket. You came alone, he said. You're 70-something years old in a restaurant, she said. What was the threat? Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile. An acknowledgement. My son underestimated you, he said. Your son put my name in a federal story to use me as a lever against Dominic. Yes, he said it without flinching. He did. And you're here to tell me why. I'm here to tell you how it started. He folded his hands on the table. His knuckles were enlarged, the hands of a man who had worked with them at some point in his life and carried the evidence. 12 years ago, the night you left Ravenport, my son Marco had a conversation with Dominic. You know what they discussed? No, you. He held her gaze. Marco told Dominic that you were leaving because Dominic's life would eventually destroy yours. That the only way to protect you was to let you go, that a woman like you deserved a clean life, and Dominic would never be able to give her one. He paused. He said it out of loyalty. He believed it. A breath. Dominic listened to him. The restaurant hummed around her. Somewhere in the kitchen, something was being reduced in a pan. The smell of it was warm and ordinary and completely at odds with what she was sitting inside. Dominic let me leave, she said slowly. Because Marco told him to. Marco told him it was the right thing. And Dominic, who was 23 and had just taken over a criminal organization and was genuinely terrified of what that meant for people he loved, believed him. Carlo's voice was steady, factual, the voice of a man delivering a verdict he'd been sitting with for a long time. He never told you he loved you enough to fight for you. He let you walk onto that bus because my son convinced him that walking away was the same thing as protecting you. She sat with that. The envelope was still in her jacket pocket. She could feel the edge of it. And now, she said, 12 years later, your son is trying to destroy him. Marco has been afraid of Dominic's transition for 2 years, Carlo said. The legitimacy push threatens everything Marco built his position on. My son is not a builder. He is a consolidator. He understands power in its traditional form, and the traditional form was working. He looked at his folded hands. When the opportunity came, the federal investigation, the media coverage, the vulnerability, he moved without consulting me. He looked up. I want you to understand that I did not know he had placed your name in the coverage until this morning. Why does that matter to me? It matters, Carlo said, because my son told Dominic 12 years ago to let you go. And now he is trying to use you to finish Dominic entirely. And I am not willing to let the same lie do damage twice. His voice didn't rise, didn't need to. What I know about the origin of the cooperation agreement, who approached whom first, what was promised, what was offered before any federal contact was made, that information changes the legal character of Marco's cooperation significantly. She understood then. He solicited it, she said. Marco went to them. They didn't come to him. He made contact 8 months ago, through an intermediary, before the media strategy, before Serena's documents, before any of this became public. He held her gaze. A cooperation agreement entered into proactively, for the purpose of eliminating a competitor, carries different legal weight than one entered into in response to a genuine investigation. You're willing to provide that to Harlan Doyle. I'm willing to provide it to anyone who needs it. He paused. With one condition. What condition? No condition on the legal matter, he said. None. That is offered freely because it is the truth, and because I am tired of watching lies metastasize. He looked at her steadily. The condition is personal. It is only for you. She waited. Read the letter, he said. She stared at him. He wrote it the night you left, Carlo said. I know because I was in the next room. I watched him write it for 2 hours. I watched him seal it. I watched him carry it for 12 years. His voice was quiet, old, the voice of a man who had watched many things and was making an accounting. I don't know what it says, but I know what it cost him not to send it, and I think you should know what you are deciding not to come back to before you decide what you're doing now. She put both hands flat on the table. The gesture, finding the surface. You loved him, she said. He was the closest thing I had to a second son. He held her gaze without apology. Marco is my blood, but Dominic was my choice, and I made the mistake of letting my blood make a decision that wasn't his to make. He paused. That mistake compounded for 12 years. I'm trying to stop the compounding. She stood up, picked up her jacket. Send everything to Harlan Doyle tonight, she said. His number is publicly listed. It will be there within the hour. She looked at him one more time, the old man in the cardigan with his enlarged knuckles and his accounting, and then she walked out of Antonelli's into the night air of Ravenport and stood on the sidewalk and put her hand in her jacket pocket and felt the envelope and started walking. She read it in her parents' kitchen. Alone, her mother and father already upstairs, the house quiet around her, the new kitchen with its solid countertops, the overhead light making a warm circle on the table. She sat down and put the envelope in front of her and looked at it for approximately 30 seconds, and then she opened it. The letter was 4 pages, handwritten, the handwriting of a 23-year-old who had learned to write with the careful precision of someone who knew words were dangerous and wanted to use them accurately. The ink was faded at the folds. Some of the lines were uneven, written fast, written under pressure, written by someone who was doing the thing and didn't have time to manage how it looked. She read it slowly. She read it twice. She was not going to put its contents on record anywhere, not because they weren't significant, but because they were his. Because a man who had carried a letter for 12 years without sending it had not been offering it for the public record, but for her, specifically, the one person it was addressed to. What she could say, after reading it, was this. He had known. He had known on the night she left exactly what he was losing and exactly why he was letting her go. And the reason he was letting her go was that Marco Volante had told him something that was true in form and false in essence. And Dominic, at 23, carrying his first year of leadership on a frame that wasn't yet strong enough, had believed it because it was easier than believing he deserved to ask her to stay. The last paragraph of the letter was 7 lines. She read those 7 lines 4 times. Then she folded the letter back into its envelope, carefully, along the original crease lines, the way she would fold a document that needed to be preserved. She set it on the table, put her hand flat on top of it, breathed. She sat in the kitchen for a while. The house settled around her. Upstairs, she could hear the faint sound of her father's television, the late news, her mother moving in the hallway, the ordinary sounds of a family being okay in a house that had been fixed by hands that never asked for thanks. She picked up her phone. She called him. He answered on the first ring. She said, "I read it." The silence lasted exactly long enough for her to understand what it cost him to wait through it. "Okay," he said. "We need to talk," she said. "In person, tomorrow. Not in your building and not in a federal conference room." "Where?" "The harbor," she said. "The bench near the old fish market, 7 in the morning." "I'll be there." She hung up, went upstairs, lay down on the bed under the water-stained bird and stared at the ceiling and let herself feel the full weight of 12 years of distance that had been, on his end, 12 years of presence. Felt the grief of it, the specific grief of time that cannot be recovered, of a version of her life that had not happened because a young man had listened to wrong counsel, and a young woman had walked away without knowing he had wanted her to turn around. She let herself feel it without performing it, without managing it, just lying there in the dark under the bird-shaped stain with the feeling moving through her the way real feelings move. Not dramatically, not in the shape that stories give them, but quietly and completely, like weather. She slept. He was already at the bench when she arrived at 10 minutes to 7. She had expected this. She walked down to the harbor with her hands in her jacket pockets, the morning cold and clear, the water catching the early light in flat silver sheets, and she sat down beside him, and they both looked at the harbor for a while without speaking. "Carlo Vellante called me last night," Dominic said. "He called me first," she said. "Did Harlan get the documents?" "Last night. He says it changes the exposure picture significantly, the cooperation agreement being proactive rather than responsive. It undermines the evidentiary weight of everything Marco provided." A pause. "It doesn't eliminate my charges. The older transactions are still what they are, but it isolates them from the Ravenport work clearly. Harlan thinks we can negotiate a resolution that doesn't involve incarceration." "Think or no?" "Think. But Harlan doesn't say think unless it's close to no." She nodded. The harbor moved. A bird she couldn't name skimmed the surface of the water and lifted. "Marco told you to let me go," she said. She felt him go still beside her. Not stiff, just arrested, the way a person goes still when a thing they've carried in private is suddenly in the open air. "Yes," he said. "You listened to him." "I was 23 and I was afraid," he said. "That is not an excuse, it is the fact." He looked at the water. "He said you deserved better. He said my life would damage yours. He said protecting you meant letting you build something clean." A breath. "And the worst part is that everything he said was true about the facts. He was right that my life was dangerous. He was right that you deserved clean. He was just wrong that those facts added up to letting you go." "He was wrong," she said, "that it was his decision to make." "Yes. And you were wrong to let someone else make it for you." "Yes." She looked at the water. "I was going to stay," she said. "That night. I had my bag packed, but I hadn't bought the ticket yet. I was waiting for you to ask me not to go." A pause. The sentence had been inside her for 12 years, and saying it out loud felt like setting down a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. "You didn't ask." "No. I thought you didn't want me to." "I know." His voice was low and rough and completely unmanaged. "I know that's what you thought. And I let you think it because I was a coward who had convinced himself that cowardice was the same thing as sacrifice." The harbor was quiet. The city behind them was waking up. She could hear it, the first traffic, the specific morning sound of Ravenport coming back to itself. The city he had rebuilt, the city she had left and returned to and was, she was beginning to understand, going to have to decide about again. "I'm angry," she said. "I want you to know that, not performed angry. Actually angry. About my parents, about the way you built things around them without their knowledge. About 12 years of you deciding from a distance what people needed without asking. About Marco, and about the letter you didn't send, and about all of it. I know. I'm going to keep being angry about some of it for a while. That's fair. And I need you to understand, going forward, if there is a going forward, that deciding what I need and building it without asking is not love. It might come from love. But the shape of it is control, and I won't live inside a structure someone built around me without my knowledge. I won't be another Ravenport. He turned and looked at her. The morning light was full on his face, and he looked tired in a way that was also somehow cleaner than she'd seen him. Like the tiredness was honest, earned, the tiredness of a man who had stopped maintaining something that had been costing him everything. I know, he said. I need more than I know. What do you need? I need you to say it like you actually understand what you're agreeing to. He held her gaze. I spent 12 years rebuilding a city because I couldn't ask one person to stay. I understand what I'm agreeing to. His voice didn't waver. I will ask. From now on, I will ask. Whatever it is, whatever I want to do, whatever I think you need, whatever I think we should be, I will ask you first. I will wait for your answer, and I will accept it. She looked at him for a long time. That's going to be difficult for you, she said. Yes, you're going to get it wrong sometimes. Probably. And I'm going to call you on it every time. I expect that. She looked back at the water. The bird that had skimmed the surface was gone, somewhere further down the harbor, out of sight. The morning was getting brighter. In a few hours, her mother's actual birthday would begin. 60 years. Cake. The three of them at the kitchen table. The family she'd been avoiding and had spent 4 days rediscovering. I'm not staying in Ravenport because of you, she said. I want to be clear about that. Okay. I'm staying because this is where my parents are, and because the city has a historic district that needs a conservator, and because I've been building a quiet life in Boston for 12 years, and quiet turns out to be a different thing than good. She paused. You are a separate consideration. Understood. A significant one. Also understood. She turned and looked at him. The harbor was behind him. The whole city spread back from the water, the city both of them had left and returned to for their own reasons. The Arts Center and the housing tower and the brewery and the old ironworks and the 7 houses with new windows and the family on Carver Street that had been quietly held together by hands that never took credit. All of it real. All of it there. All of it complicated in the way that real things are complicated, without apology. 2 conditions, she said. Tell me. My parents get the full truth. From you, in person. Not a managed version, not through lawyers or charitable framing. You sit down with my father and you tell him exactly what you did and why, and you let him respond however he responds. He absorbed this. She watched him absorb it, watched him sit with the prospect of Thomas Mercer's response, which would be considerable, and decide not to flinch from it. Yes, he said. Second condition. She reached into her jacket pocket and took out the letter, held it in both hands, the white envelope worn soft along the creases. You write another one, not to me, to yourself, about what you're changing and why. And you read it every time you're about to make a decision for someone else without asking them. She held it out to him. Not because I need the gesture, because you need the practice. He looked at the letter. His letter, 12 years old, being handed back. He took it with both hands, carefully, the way you take something that has weight. Okay, he said quietly. She stood up from the bench. The morning was fully established now, the harbor bright, the city going about its life behind them. Come to dinner tonight, she said. My mother's birthday. 7 o'clock. Don't bring anything. She paused. Except whatever you're going to say to my father. Have that ready. Vivian, 7 o'clock, she said. And she walked back toward the city, toward Carver Street, toward the house with the navy trim and the rebuilt steps and the maple tree that had been growing for 23 years. The conversation between Dominic and her father lasted 45 minutes in the living room, while Vivian and her mother sat in the kitchen pretending to prepare food that was already prepared. Vivian could hear the register of the voices without the words. Her father's, lower and slower than usual, the particular vocal weight of a man processing something that was reorganizing his understanding of the last 2 years. Dominic's even and unhurried, with none of the management, none of the composure as performance she'd watched him maintain through federal interviews and organizational crises. Just the voice of someone saying the true thing. At one point, there was a silence that lasted long enough that her mother set down the serving spoon and looked at the doorway. Then her father said something. One short sentence, too low to hear. Then Dominic said something, equally short. Then the register of both voices changed. Not warmer exactly, but different. Less load-bearing. The specific acoustic of two people who have arrived at an understanding they didn't expect to arrive at. Her mother picked the serving spoon back up. Dinner was not simple. Thomas Mercer ate the first half of his meal in the silence of a man who had been shown a version of the last 2 years that contradicted the version he'd been living in and working out which parts he could accept and which parts would take longer. He asked Dominic 2 direct questions over the course of the meal, both of them about the consulting work specifically. Whether it was real, whether the work product had been real, whether his contribution had been genuine or performative. Dominic answered both questions with the same directness he'd used in the living room. Yes, real. Your knowledge of the city was genuinely necessary. Her father ate the rest of his meal. After dinner, he stood up from the table and picked up his plate and Dominic's and carried them to the kitchen, which was his way of indicating that a matter had been moved to a different category. Not resolved, moved. He would work the rest of it out privately, in his own way, over weeks and months, and the working out would look like his father's return to a kind of dignity that had been quietly restored to him and that he was only now learning the provenance of. Ellen brought out the cake. 60 candles was impractical, and she had used 10 instead, arranged in a circle, and the light of them was warm and domestic and completely ordinary, and Vivian sat at the table with her parents, and the man she had left and returned to and watched her mother make a wish she didn't share and blow out every candle in one breath. Later, after her father had gone upstairs and her mother had followed, Vivian walked Dominic to the front door. They stood on the porch in the April night, the city quiet around them, the maple tree solid in the front yard. "Serena," she said. "I know." He looked at the street. "She called me this morning. She wanted to— apologize is not quite the right word. She wanted to explain." "What did you say?" "I said I'd heard her explanation at the diner and that I understood her reasoning and that I was angry and that I needed time." "Is the anger real?" "Yes." He paused. "So is the understanding. Both things." He looked at her. "She's leaving the organization. She told me this morning. She's been offered a position with a corporate consulting firm in Chicago, and she's taking it." He was quiet for a moment. "I think she's been trying to leave for a year and didn't know how to do it without destroying something on her way out. She destroyed several things." "Yes." A pause. "But she also pointed you at evidence that saved the Ravenport projects. And she called you instead of a stranger because somewhere in the calculation she knew you were the person who would handle it right." He looked at the maple tree. "She is a complicated person who loves badly. She's not the only one in this story who qualifies." Vivian looked at him, at the tired, open face of a man who had stopped performing being something and was just being it. "The charges," she said. "What happens?" "Harlan is in negotiation. There will be an agreement. There will be a record. There will be a period of consequence." He said the word without drama. "I've accepted that." "What kind of consequence?" "Fines. Restrictions on certain business activities for a defined period. Possibly supervised probation of the organizational structure." He paused. "Not incarceration. Harlan is confident of that, based on the cooperation credit and the Ravenport documentation and what Carlo Vellante provided." "And the organization?" "The transition continues," he said. "The community trusts are legally independent. The housing projects, the commercial development, the art center, none of that is implicated because all of it is documented clearly and accurately." He met her eyes. "What I built here stands." She looked at him and thought about the woman at the ceramics wheel through the gallery window, the clay rising under focused hands. "The thing you make out of what you have, in the time you have." "It does," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he nodded once, like a man accepting the terms of something he had no intention of violating. 7 o'clock tomorrow," she said. "I'm looking at studio space in the historic district, the old Delaney building on Prospect. I need a second pair of eyes on the structural condition."
Something moved through his face that she had no name for and didn't need one. "I'll be there."
He walked down the porch steps and along the front walk and out to the street, and she stood on the porch and watched him go. Not standing still, not looking at a bus until it disappeared, not carrying a letter he would never send. Just walking at a normal pace through the city he had built, toward whatever came next. She went inside, locked the door, stood in the quiet hallway with the family photographs on the wall, the ones she'd avoided looking at the night she arrived, and she looked at them now. Her parents young, her own childhood in sequential frames, a photograph of this house taken in better years before the worse ones, a photograph she didn't expect to find near the end of the row, faded, slightly out of focus, of two teenagers on the Ravenport waterfront, the harbor behind them, both of them looking at something outside the frame. She stood in front of that photograph for a long time. Then she went upstairs and slept, fully and without dreaming, for the first time in 4 days.
Yeah, the Delaney building was on the corner of Prospect and Marin Street, federal style, like most of the historic district, 4 stories of 19th century brick with casement windows and the particular presence of a structure that had been standing long enough to acquire character in the way buildings do when they survive long enough. It had been a printing press, then a warehouse, then empty for 11 years. She arrived at 6:50 and walked the exterior first, the way she always started, reading the surface before the interior, learning what the building had been through before she asked it what it could become. The brick was mostly sound. One section of the north face had been repointed recently, within the last few years, and whoever had done it had matched the mortar correctly, which was rarer than it should have been. The window casements needed work, but the glass in several of them was original, wavy in the particular way of 19th century glass, and she stood in front of one window for a moment and looked through it at the distorted version of the street on the other side, and thought about what it meant to preserve the imperfect original, instead of replacing it with something flatter and clearer and less true. Dominic arrived at 7 exactly. No suit today. Dark jacket, plain shirt, the version of him that was off the operational clock. He had coffee, 2 cups. He held one out to her without speaking. She took it. "Tell me what you see," he said. She looked up at the building. Original structure is sound. The repointing on the north face is good work. Someone knew what they were doing. Interior is going to need a full assessment, but the bones suggest it's worth it. She sipped the coffee. The light will be good in the afternoon. West-facing studio space with 19th century windows and afternoon light is... She paused. "It's the right space." "For what specifically?" "Conservation studio, private clients, institutional contracts, some teaching eventually." She looked at him. "I have relationships in Boston with 4 museums and 2 private collectors. They'll follow the work wherever the work is." "You've been planning this." "I've been thinking about it since Friday morning when I walked past the Arts Center." She looked back at the building. "I'm good at my work. I've been doing it in a city that isn't mine, for institutions that are perfectly good and mean nothing to me, and I've been calling that a life." She paused. "It was a performance of a life." He was quiet for a moment. "What changed?" "I came home," she said simply. The morning was full around them. The historic district waking up, a delivery truck on the next block, a woman unlocking the door of a shop across the street. Ordinary, real. The particular texture of a city that was alive. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, "before this goes further." He waited. "I'm not coming back because you rebuilt the city. I'm not coming back because of the letter, or because of what Carlo told me, or because of the federal situation, or because of any of the things that happened this week." She looked at him. "I'm coming back because when I got off that train on Thursday, I was standing on a platform in a city I'd spent 12 years making myself not miss, and I missed it the second I smelled the air." She held his gaze. "That has nothing to do with you. That's mine." "I know," he said. "And what happens between us, if it happens because we decide it does. Not because you've arranged circumstances or I feel obligated or there's a story in which this is the ending." She paused. "It happens because we choose it clearly, with full information, as 2 people who know what the other one actually is." "Full information," he said. "That's a high bar. You have a pending federal resolution and a history in organized crime and a compulsive need to fix things without asking permission." She said it straight. "I know all of that.
And you have 12 years of practice distance and a habit of leaving before things can fail you, and a tendency to mistake competence for invulnerability. He said it equally straight. She looked at him. We're a disaster. Probably. On paper. On most surfaces, he agreed. She looked back at the Delaney building, at the wavy original glass in the casement windows, at the north face with its well-matched mortar, at the whole standing imperfect structure of it, still here, after 140 years of being the thing it was. I'm going to need a structural engineer to assess the interior load-bearing elements before I can sign a lease, she said. Do you know a good one? I know 3. Conflict of interest. 2 of them work independently. Send me their names. She finished the coffee. And Dominic. She looked at him one more time, the full look, nothing managed on either side. Next time you want to do something for someone I love, ask first. Yes, he said, like a man who had decided to say it and meant it and was going to say it every time it needed to be said, for as long as it needed to be said. She handed him the empty cup, turned toward the building entrance. Coming? She said. He fell in beside her. 2 weeks later, Vivian signed the lease on the 3rd floor of the Delaney building. The space got afternoon light through wavy 19th century glass, exactly as she'd predicted. She spent the first week cleaning it herself, the way she always started new spaces, alone, by hand, building her understanding of the place through the work of preparing it. Her first piece, an 18th century maritime painting from a Ravenport institution that had been waiting 18 months for the right conservator, arrived in a wooden crate on a Tuesday morning, and she unpacked it with the specific care of someone greeting something that had been waiting. Her parents came to see the studio. Her father stood in the middle of the space and looked at the painting on the work table and at the light coming through the old glass, and at his daughter in her work apron with her tools laid out in careful order, and he said simply that it was good work. She understood that he meant both the restoration and the decision to stay. Her mother cried a little, which she denied. Serena Falcone left Ravenport on a Thursday. She did not come to say goodbye to Vivian directly. She sent a text that said, I broke several things. Some of them maybe needed breaking. I'm sorry for the ones that didn't. Vivian sat with that text for a while before she responded. She responded, take care of yourself. She meant it. The federal resolution came through in May. It was what Harlan had described. Fines, structural restrictions, a supervised compliance period for the remaining Falcone holdings. No incarceration. The record was public, which meant the accounting was public. What the organization had been, what it had done, what it was becoming. Some people in Ravenport read it and were angry. Some read it and were less surprised than they might have been. The families in the Harborview Tower and the repaired houses on the residential blocks read it, most of them, and made of it what they each decided to make of it, which was the most anyone could ask. The Ravenport Heritage Initiative continued. The community trusts held. The Art Center in the old Hartwell Ironworks held its first open exhibition in June, and Vivian went on a Saturday afternoon and stood in front of a painting on the 2nd floor. Local artist, not famous, just good, and felt the particular satisfaction of a city doing what cities do when they're actually alive. On a morning in late spring, she was at her work table when she heard footsteps on the studio stairs. His footsteps. She knew them now, the particular rhythm of them. And then the door opened, and he was there in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee and the morning light coming through the wavy glass behind her and laying its imperfect version of the world across the floor. She didn't stop working. She held out her hand. He put the cup in it. He crossed the studio and stood beside her and looked at the painting on the table. The maritime piece, nearly finished, the layers of accumulated damage lifted away one careful session at a time to reveal the original beneath. She had been working it for 3 weeks. It was almost done. What was it? He asked, looking at the painting. A storm scene, she said. 18th century. Someone in the 1940s decided they didn't like the storm and painted over it with calmer water. She set down the swab she was holding. The storm was always there, just covered. He looked at the painting. She looked at the painting. The harbor in it was dark and moving and honest, the water doing exactly what water does, not the flattened, peaceful version someone had decided was easier to live with, but the real thing, turbulent and deep, and still somehow beautiful in the way that real things are when you've stopped being afraid of them. It's better, he said. Yes, she said, It is. She picked up her swab. He stood beside her and drank his coffee and didn't try to fix anything. And the morning light came through the old glass and made its wavy, imperfect version of the world across the floor of a room where something real was being carefully returned to what it had always been. Outside, Ravenport was going about its life. Fade out.